Thank you. You're now live.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the inquiry. We'll resume proceedings. We're due to hear now the council's evidence, as I said earlier on this morning, and there's only one witness, I think, Mr. Coleman. So I'll allow Mr. Wilcox to introduce his first witness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Coleman, I'll introduce you to the inquiry. Your name's David Coleman. You hold an MA in Planning Policy and Practice from London South Bank University and an upper second-class honours degree in Geography from the University of Liverpool. You've been a town planner for nearly 20 years with a variety of senior positions in both the public and private sectors. You're also a chartered member of the RTPI and a member of the Institute of Leadership. You're the Managing Director and founder of DAC Planning, which you established in 2016 to provide advice and support to local authorities, local communities and public sector bodies nationally. Your company specialises in developing skills and capacity in local government, supporting plan making and infrastructure planning. You also support local authorities with planning appeals, research and evidence-based gathering. You're based at the University of Essex's Innovation Centre in Colchester. Your proof goes on to describe the range of experiences that you've had professionally. I won't read all of them out, save that you note in paragraph 1.4 of your proof that between 2010 and 2016 you worked for Malden Council, where you led the production and independent examination of the local development plan. Mr. Coleman, if you can just turn please to paragraph 1.10 of your proof of evidence, page 4. Where you've set out your professional declaration. Can you just confirm orally to the inquiry, please, that that declaration remains true today?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. As I indicated earlier on, sir, I don't propose to have Mr. Coleman read out chunks of his proof. Rather, I'm going to focus in questions on what seem to me to be the key points that will most help you. What I'd like to begin with that in mind, Mr. Coleman, is the context within which Latchingdon sits within the wider district area. And if we could begin, please, by taking up core document 3.1, which is the LDP itself. And within that document, going to page 23. Perhaps, Mr. Coleman, you can explain for the benefit of the inquiry within the key plan diagram we find there, where Latchingdon is and how it's located within what's been referred to as the Dengie Peninsula, please.
Yes, certainly. So, as you said, this is the key diagram from the local development plan. So it shows you the district, and I think it's helpful to see the context geographically of the district and of where Latchingdon sits within that context. So as you rightly said, essentially the area to the south of the Blackwater estuary, to the south and east of Malden and Heybridge, and to the north of Burnham and Crouch is the Dengie Peninsula. So you have the Blackwater estuary to the North Sea to the east, and the Crouch to the south. So it's essentially access is out to the west. So Latchingdon sits fairly centrally within the Dengie Peninsula, albeit obviously slightly to the west. If you can see it, it's, Mayland is highlighted, as is Southminster, as they are larger villages. Latchingdon, I hope you can see, is just to the southwest of Mayland, and as I said already, to the southeast of Malden.
And in terms of the characteristics of the Dengie Peninsula as a geographical area, what are the features which define the peninsula, please?
The peninsula itself is actually surprisingly remote for somewhere that's only 60, 70 miles from London. So as you've heard already, the roads are quite rural. There are no A roads. There is a train line in the south of the Dengie Peninsula, which is a branch line which serves Burnham on Crouch and Southminster. But the Dengie Peninsula itself is very open, flat land, predominantly agricultural in nature, and the agricultural past has helped to shape the form of the village and the roads that sit there now. So there are a range of small and medium-sized and larger villages, small rural settlements that sit across the Dengie. But there is, I would say, quite a special character to the area, certainly quite surprising for those who don't know the area and haven't visited. So that kind of unique rural character has helped to shape the characteristics of the individual settlements within there.
And zooming in a little bit then to the more immediate surroundings of Latchingdon, can we please take up Mr. Milcreast's proof of evidence? And on page 67 of that document, we find a very helpful OS map of the wider Dengie Peninsula centred on Latchingdon.
Is this the...
It's described as proof plan CM1.
The bigger document, is it? Or?
I think it's...
I've actually got a different page number.
Oh, have you? Okay.
What's your I've got page number 35.
35, okay. It's 67 in mine. That's okay. Let's see, as long as we're all looking.
It's proof plan CM1.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, in terms of what we can see on this plan, Mr. Coleman, now we're all looking at the right thing. What this OS map helpfully allows us to do is to see some of the shapes and characteristics of the settlements around Latchingdon as well as Latchingdon itself. What are the characteristic features, if any, of the settlements in this part of the Dengie Peninsula that you'd like to draw to the inspector's attention, please?
Thank you. Yes, I think the key features I'd like to highlight are the straight and then abruptly curving roads. So if you look at where Latchingdon is in the centre of the plan, you'll see the Latchingdon Road to the west, and you'll see that from Cold Norton travels east in a fairly straight line and then abruptly turns southwards before turning eastwards again. So these bends are features of the roads within the Dengie area. And you'll see that the shape of the settlements, the villages, sit neatly within those curves or around those curves. And the settlements themselves are generally linear in nature, so they follow the path of that road. And you can see, obviously, Hawthorne is a good example. Obviously, there's some newer development there, which has changed the shape slightly, but you can see that the patterns of the settlements, the shapes of the settlements are relatively regular. And yes, follow the road, the dynamics of the road, if you like, and the curves and the bends in the road.
Thank you. And continuing on the theme of the character of settlements on the Dengie Peninsula, can we have a look next, please, at the characterisation assessment, which is core document 3.20. And thank you, sir, within the document, electronic page 10, please, hard copy page 6. We find the classification of the settlement. So it tells you for each settlement within the area what sort of what typology it falls within. And how is Latchingdon identified within paragraph 3.4 of this typology list, please?
It's identified as an agricultural settlement.
Thank you. And if we can go on to to PDF page 55 please, which is going to be hard copy page 51. We find here this document's description of the key characteristics of the agricultural settlement. So, are there any particular points here you'd like to draw to the inspector's attention, Mr. Coleman?
I think it's useful to see that there are common characteristics to these types of settlements. So you can see that they're located above reclaimed marshes on clay lands. They're in areas of early open field enclosure, often have nucleated or linear forms that were well established by the late medieval period. For the majority of the villages, the parish church is still the dominant architectural statement and stands at the heart of the village. Sorry, I was just going to say that the document goes on to then explain in more detail a number of different characteristics of these villages.
Thank you. And in terms of how, if at all, the document can help us on how those key characteristics are to be protected, can we go on, please, to page 65, hard copy 61, where we have a list of what are described as specific policies. I should stress, so these aren't development plan policies. These are what are called policies within the characterisation assessment. And what, if any, assistance, Mr. Coleman, can the inspector draw from the first of those policies, policy 6.1, please?
So the first policy is suggested the prominent linear form of the settlement should be maintained and closes and cul-de-sacs should be avoided.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to have a look at Latchingdon itself now, continuing to zoom in. And we started with the peninsula as a whole, then we looked more locally, and now we're going to look at Latchingdon itself. For this, please, can you take up your proof of evidence? And we're going to go to pages 18 and 19, please. And we'll begin, please, with figure 4.22.2, which is the top of page 19, area view of Latchingdon in 2000. What's your assessment, Mr. Coleman, of the size and shape of Latchingdon as at 2000, shown in this photograph, please?
As at 2000, you can still clearly see, I would say, the historic core of the village around the church and the main junction that you heard about earlier this morning. You can see there's been some growth, particularly to the east of Burnham Road, but generally the pattern of the development follows the linear form of the road.
And how? What's your assessment of how that pattern relates to the dingy peninsula pattern of settlements that we looked at in the characterisation assessment?
I'd say it's broadly consistent, and certainly this would have the settlement would have looked more or less like this at the time the characterisation assessment was being developed, I would imagine. So that traditional form, linear nature, is relatively intact.
Moving from 2000 to the present, please, on the previous page, page 18, you have figure 4.22.1, which shows the appeal site in red. It outlines, I think, the settlement as at 2000 in the black line boundary, and then you have areas in green, which the key tells us are approved applications above 5 dwellings outside of the settlement boundary, and the key tells us that since 2014. What's your assessment, please, of the character of Latchingdon in terms of the Dengie Peninsula points we've talked about when we take into account these further permissions?
You can see that the number of permissions has been considerable since 2014. So the green areas, all of which are located outside of the settlement boundary. So the settlement boundary, which is the black line, and as identified in the LDP, is essentially seeking to retain the more traditional form of the settlement. The green areas are and the new permissions are starting to erode, generally starting to erode that, albeit on the whole following a linear pattern, in that they are following the shape of the road, if you like, extending the built area further to the south, generally.
Thank you. Keeping that plan page open, and in the light of the points we've just talked about, I'd like to ask you some questions about what in your view will be the impact of the proposal on Latchingdon, please. Now, I think I can lead you on the fact that the proposal involves 160 units. Can you help the inspector on the area of the appeal site, please?
The appeal site is 10.12 or 10.1 hectares in size.
Okay, and are you aware of what the area is of the Latchingdon settlement boundary as drawn by the development plan?
The settlement boundary in the development plan is 19 hectares in size.
In terms then of a 19 hectare settlement with a 10.1 hectare addition of new development, what's your assessment of the impact of the proposal in terms of scale on the identity of the village?
The appeal proposal, if allowed, would extend the settlement boundary obviously considerably to the east, increasing the size by 53%, so it represents a 53% increase in the settlement area, or sorry, the defined settlement boundary area. It doesn't include the other sites that have consent outside of the boundary.
Now, you've mentioned there the 53% increase. Can you expand, please, on the point you made about pulling the boundary to the east? What will be the effect of the proposal on the shape of the settlement in your assessment?
Well, essentially, it's adding a significant area currently in use as agricultural fields to the east of the settlement, essentially breaking the linear pattern. It's extending further east away from Burnham Road into the countryside. The southern edge is obviously going to follow is going to extend along Burnham Road, but essentially it's an extension of the village out eastwards, away from the linear form, further eroding the character, or that traditional character of an agricultural settlement that we referred to before.
And drawing the threads of that little section of evidence together then, what's your overall assessment, please, taking into account the size of the development and the shape of the development relative to the settlement? What's your overall assessment, please, of the impact of the proposal on the character and identity of Latchingdon?
I would say it would fundamentally change the character and identity by extending the development, extending the built developed area to the east, changing the pattern, less linear in nature, and the scale of the proposed development would be out of keeping with the village and the rural identity, and the identity as an agricultural settlement.
Thank you. And with page 18 still open, is there anything you'd like to say in terms of the cumulative impact of the proposal, given the existing permissions identified there in green? What's the cumulative impact, if any, on Latchingdon's character and identity, please?
Well, I think it's considerable cumulatively. In isolation, it's already quite considerable. Just bear with me. Obviously, the quantity of homes that have already been permitted I think it's 100. I'm just trying to see. It's 162. So on the previous page of my proof of evidence, page 17, there's a table that sets out the sites that are shown in green, essentially on the plan on page 18. So these are sites that are outside of the settlement boundary for 5 or more dwellings and have obtained planning consent since the plan period started in 2014. So these sites total 162 dwellings. With the addition of another 160 dwellings as proposed, this would obviously cumulatively become very considerable. So,
and just by way of context for that, what's the size of Latchingdon in terms of dwelling numbers without the 162 you just referred to?
So it's approximately, so I'm just looking for the number, approximately 500 dwellings in Latchingdon, and that's based on census information. Sorry, so it's paragraph 4.14 of my proof. So according to the 2011 census, there were 491 households in Latchingdon in 2011. So with an addition of 160 dwellings, that would increase the number of households or dwellings in the village from, and these are approximate numbers, 491 to 651. And that would represent approximately 33% increase in the total number of dwellings in the village. If you look at that cumulatively with the existing consented development shown on page 17 in the table 4.22.1, you would, the total number of dwellings equates to 322 dwellings, which represents a 66% increase in the total number of dwellings in Latchingdon, as well as the considerable increase to the built-up area that we've already referred to.
Changing subject then slightly, Mr. Coleman, I'd like to look now at what are agreed to be the key relevant policies of the local plan, please. So if we can take up core document 3.1. Which is where we find it. And we're going to begin within core document 3.1, please, on page 14. Where we will find policy S1, which is the first of the 3 policies I'm going to ask you about. Perhaps by way of introduction to the policy, Mr. Coleman, can you help the inspector with the structure and the purpose of policy S1 within the LDP, please?
Yes, certainly. Policy S1 is, as it says, entitled Sustainable Development, and it's the first policy of the plan. It's a strategic policy which is intended to provide the overall direction for the policies of the plan and for development proposals that follow. It sets out the presumption in favour of sustainable development and provides a number of key principles for policy and decision making.
Looking at those key principles, please, can we begin with principle 2, which is the delivery of a sustainable level of housing growth that will meet local needs and deliver a wide choice of high quality homes in the most sustainable locations. What's your assessment, please, of the appeal proposal against that principle?
My assessment is that the appeal proposal is contrary to this criteria of the policy. The policy states delivering a sustainable level of housing growth to meet local needs and deliver the choice of homes in the most sustainable locations. That's then a thread that runs through the plan in terms of where the growth is planned to take place and how the rest of the policies are then structured, which I'm sure we're going to come on to. So my assessment is that this proposal, in the context of this policy requirement, the proposed development does not represent a sustainable level of housing growth to meet local needs, and it isn't in one of the most sustainable locations, because they are the locations that are identified by the LDP through the allocations and other policies of the plan.
Moving on to Principle 3, we have promote the effective use of land and prioritise development on previously developed land and planned growth in the garden suburbs and strategic allocations. Same question, please. How do you assess the proposal against the requirements of Principle 3?
My assessment is that the proposal is contrary to this part of the policy. It does not promote the effective use of land, which is obviously something that the NPPF encourages and the LDP seeks to carry forward. And it does not prioritise development on previously developed land or planned growth at garden suburbs and strategic allocations. It's a greenfield site outside of settlement boundaries, so contrary to that part of the policy.
And final principle I want to ask you about, please, is Principle 12, towards the bottom of the page, which is to maintain the rural character of the district without compromising the identity of its individual settlements. Again, please, can we have your assessment of the proposal against Principle 12?
Again, my assessment is that the proposal is contrary to this part of the policy. As just discussed, I don't believe it to be in keeping with the identity of the settlement of Latchingdon, and I don't believe it contributes towards maintaining the rural character of the district. So I do believe it would compromise the identity of Latchingdon and therefore be contrary to this.
Given the views you've given about Principles 2, 3 and 12, what's your assessment of the proposal against Policy S1 as a whole, please?
My assessment is that the proposal is contrary to Policy S1 as a whole.
And final question on S1 is in respect of its consistency or non-consistency, as you'll tell us, with the current version of the NPPF. How do you assess whether or not this policy is up to date in NPPF terms, please?
So obviously we're required to look at, as you've said, how consistent this policy is. All of the policies when determining how much weight to give the policy, and the policy is more than 5 years old. But my interpretation for this, or my view for the purposes of this inquiry, this appeal, is that this policy is wholly consistent with national planning policy. It was produced and examined under the NPPF 2012, but I am comfortable that this policy remains in accordance with the NPPF as a whole, and I believe it should be given full weight in that regard.
Thank you very much. If we can move on, please, to page 17 within the document, we find policy S2. I'd like to take a similar structure of questions, please, in respect of this policy. So, first of all, what's the structure and purpose of policy S2 as you understand it, please, Mr. Coleman?
Policy S2, entitled Strategic Growth, is there to essentially set out how the council and how the plan will meet the needs of the district over the plan period, which runs to 2029. So it provides the direction and the locations for growth to meet the needs. The needs, as defined by the plan, objectively assessed needs were 310 homes per annum. And the policy sets out a number of elements, or provides a number of elements, as to how these needs are to be met. It then goes on to actually quantify the needs by location and type of development, housing development coming forward. So I should qualify, when it talks about housing, when it talks about meeting the needs, it's meeting the housing needs, not employment needs. That's dealt with separately. So the policy itself clearly signals that the majority of new growth will be delivered through sustainable extensions to Malden, Heybridge and Burnham on Crouch in the form of garden suburbs and strategic allocations. Those locations are the largest settlements in the district, and in fact the only towns in the district. All the other settlements are smaller in nature. It's clear that the scale and type, use and form of development should reflect the role of those areas. It does make clear that a proportion of new development will be directed to the rural villages to support rural housing needs, local services and facilities and the rural economy. Strategic growth in those areas, in the rural villages, will be related to the settlement hierarchy, will reflect the size, function and physical capacity of the settlement and will not result in unsustainable spatial patterns to the detriment of the wider area. It talks about infrastructure constraints, which were a key determinant in setting that growth strategy. Do you want me to just...
And in terms of how you assess the appeal proposal and the appeal site against the structure, purpose and requirements of policy S2, what's your assessment, please?
My assessment is that the proposal doesn't accord with policy S2 as a whole, because it doesn't accord with any of the categories of growth that have been identified in policy S2. So overleaf on page 18, the policy sets out those sources of supply to meet the needs. It sets out a supply of housing which is over and above the objectively assessed needs of the plan. So that's, just to remind you, 4,650 homes required, a minimum. The plan seeks to deliver 5,108. And the categories that are shown on the table on page 18, there are two categories that are potentially relevant to growth of this nature. One is neighbourhood plans, where 100 units were identified, and the other is a windfall allowance, where 300 units were identified across the plan period. I'm confident that the proposed development doesn't fit into any of those categories for the reasons which I can explain.
Thank you. And final question on S2, what's your assessment of its consistency with the MPPF, please?
Again, I am comfortable that the policy and the spatial strategy is consistent with the MPPF. There are some changes to the MPPF, clearly, that will need to be looked at by the council, such as a requirement for small sites. I haven't looked at that in detail, but as a whole, in terms of how this policy sits with national policy, I'm comfortable that it's consistent with national policy, and therefore I believe full weight should be applied to this policy.
Thank you. Can we then go next, please, to S8, which you find at page 45? Thank you. Again, similar structure. What's the structure and purpose of S8, please?
S8 is really directed towards the countryside areas and to settlement boundaries, so areas outside of the main towns and the allocations. This provides for a settlement hierarchy for the district. You'll see there four categories: main settlements, larger villages and smaller villages, and lastly other villages.
And where do we see Latchingdon within that?
Latchingdon sits within the category of smaller villages. The policy goes on to explain, again, an important thread through the plan, that the countryside will be protected for its landscape, natural resources and ecological value, as well as its intrinsic character and beauty. Outside of defined settlement boundaries, the garden suburbs and the allocations, planning permission for development will only be granted where the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside is not adversely impacted upon, and provided it is for And then the policy goes on to set out a series of uses, which, as long as they don't impact upon the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside, would be acceptable, could be acceptable.
And in terms of that list of uses that could be acceptable, subject to the impact point you described, how does the appeal proposal fit against those, please?
The appeal proposal doesn't accord with any of those categories.
Thank you. Again, following the structure of my previous questions, how do you assess the consistency of this policy against the NPPF, please?
In a similar way, I'm comfortable that the policy as a whole is consistent with the NPPF.
Thank you very much. Final question I want to ask you, please, in respect of this policy, in respect to policy S8, is about its restrictive nature and on the subject of NPPF compliance. A point that's made by Mr. Armstrong is that the policy is a restrictive one and so may to that extent be contrary to the NPPF. What's your assessment, please, of Mr. Armstrong's approach to the restrictive nature of this policy?
I fundamentally would disagree with it being inconsistent in that way and with it being overly restrictive. The plan was produced and examined under the NPPF 2012. And there haven't been significant changes to the NPPF in that time that would mean that it was possible to have a restrictive policy then, but it isn't now. I would argue that the general requirements in the NPPF in terms of how restrictive policies should or should not be have not changed greatly. I would also add that this was an issue that was considered, as were many issues through the examination of the plan itself. And because of the importance of the issue, the inspector for the local plan examination, that in his report made specific comment on this issue. His report, if I may, is CD 3.16, and it's paragraph 121 of his report.
Which I think you set out in your proof.
I do.
So we can avoid opening.
It's 3.16, and this is also in paragraph 4.31 of my proof.
May avoid opening another document, sir, just for a reference that's in the proof.
Yeah. Right. Yes. This was 2017, wasn't it?
This was the inspector's report. Yes.
Yeah.
And short question, Mr. Coleman. What was the examining inspector's assessment of the suggestion that the policy was restrictive in a way that created an NPPF problem?
He concluded that the approach taken by Policy S8 is consistent with the framework's core planning principles. It strikes a suitable balance between recognising the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside and supporting the thriving rural communities within it.
Thank you. Now, obviously, in 2017, the examining inspector would have been looking at the 2012 NPPF. Have there been any relevant changes between 2012 and 2023 in the NPPF in respect of that analysis?
No, I don't believe so.
Thank you. Another point the appellant makes in respect of the agreed conflicts with the three policies we looked at is that they are, I think Mr. Armstrong's word is technical conflicts. Do you have any comment you wish to make on that approach to policy analysis and policy compliance?
I believe that a proposal should be either judged to be in accordance with or not in accordance with a policy or a development plan as a whole. The basis of decision making is, as you will well know, section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, and that requires decisions to be taken in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. This is not just a technical issue in terms of compliance. It is not compliant, and I don't think there is a category for technical non-compliance.
Changing subject then slightly, Mr. Coleman, I want to ask you a few questions about housing land supply, please. Now, it's agreed between the main parties that the land supply position is currently 5.97 years. What are the implications of that state of affairs for this proposal, please, in terms of how it's assessed against the MPPF in particular?
So for the purposes of the MPPF, that means that the tilted balance or paragraph 11D doesn't apply. So whereas previously the settlement boundaries would have been considered out of date when there is no 5-year land supply, where there is a 5-year land supply, the settlement boundaries are fully in force, if you like, and a full policy consideration. So I think it changes the way that the proposal is viewed considerably.
And you'll recall when we looked in your proof at page 18, we saw the currently consented developments in the plan period, which were shown in the green boxes. They were described in your table 4.22.1 as well. At the time that those permissions were granted, could the council demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply or not?
I couldn't give you a categorical answer to that, but my understanding is that there wasn't a 5-year land supply. There's certainly for a significant period of time after the adoption of the plan, the council has not been able to demonstrate a 5-year land supply.
Thank you. Can we take up next, please, still on the theme of land supply, core documents 3.3. Where we will find, I hope, the 2022-23 AMR.
Right, thank you. This is the latest one, is it? 22, 23?
Yes.
And within the AMR, Mr. Coleman, we find in particular a couple of tables. I'd like to begin, please, with table 1, which is on page 1. That shows housing delivery over the development plan period. It gives us for each year from 2014-15 to 22-23, the annual requirement, net recorded completions, and then shortfall or surplus for each year. What, if anything, Mr. Coleman, do you take from that data about the direction of travel of housing delivery in the Malden district, please? Is it getting better or worse, or is it the same?
It's considerably better over recent years.
How do we see that? Can you?
Yeah, certainly. So if you look at the final column that shows shortfall and surplus for each year, you'll see that each year is being monitored against an annual requirement of 310 homes per year, which is the requirement in the LDP policy S2. Just to note that that's not the same as local housing need, which is now less. But when looking at this, the performance that's shown for the first few years of the plan period, so 2014 until 2017-18, you'll see that there was a deficit against the requirement. I know firsthand that was because, at least in part, if not considerably, because the plan was going through local plan examination, so it wasn't fully in place, it wasn't approved at that point. The plan was approved in 2017 by the Secretary of State, and you can see from 2018-19 onwards a dramatically improving pattern. So 152 above the requirement in 2019-20, 116 above in 2020-2021. There is a reduction after that. It's still above the requirement, but it's not as far above the requirement. And I would suggests that COVID and a pandemic would have had at least something to do with that. And even during those times, the district or the council was still delivering a level of housing which was above the 310 annual housing requirement. Most recently, 2022 to 2023, 449 homes were delivered against a requirement of 310. So over the plan period as a whole, against the 310 requirement, there is a cumulative shortfall of 109, but you can see that the direction of travel is very much that looks like it will be addressed. Obviously, I can't speculate for sure, but it looks like it will be addressed if the pattern continues of over-delivering, as we've seen in the last 4 monitoring years.
And on the theme of future delivery, can we turn the page, please, to table 2 of the most recent AMR? What we have here are the LDP allocations identified. We have the housing trajectory for each allocation and its planning permission net capacity. We have what it should have delivered by the monitoring year, its actual delivery to the monitoring year, and then that expressed as a percentage. What can the inspector take from this data about the prospects of future housing delivery in the district?
Well, I think you can read this in one of 2 ways. You can see that this is showing that everything that was expected to be delivered hasn't been delivered. Or I would argue, more importantly, you can see that this means that there are a large number of consents and schemes in the pipeline that are yet to deliver, but will be delivering. So, for instance, S2A, which is it's South Malden Garden Suburb, is allocated for 1,000 dwellings, and still has a good proportion of those, over a half, still to be delivered. The same with North Heybridge Garden Suburb. So there is considerable progress, I'm aware, being made on these sites, which to the best of my knowledge, isn't going to stop in the near future. So the pipeline and the future supply is looking very positive. So I take comfort from that table.
And then final couple of questions from me, Mr. Coleman, before I hand you over to my learned friend, are about your assessment, forgive me, of the planning balance overall. Now you've told us in evidence that your assessment is that the proposal is in conflict with the 3 key development plan policies we identified. In your proof, you identify and apply weight to a number of planning benefits. And as the inspector's seen those, we don't need to go through them. Perhaps can you give the inspector your overall assessment on whether the planning benefits of the scheme, as you've identified them, do or don't outweigh the development plan conflict?
Put plainly, I don't believe that the benefits outweigh the conflict with the development plan. I think the starting point is the development plan. It's agreed that this proposed development is contrary to those 3 key policies, 3 key relevant policies of the development plan, S1, S2 and S8. And whilst I acknowledge that there are considerable benefits that would be offered by the scheme, I simply don't believe that those would overcome that conflict with the development plan.
Mr. Coleman, bear with me 1 second. Thank you very much, Mr. Coleman. So those are my questions in chief. I think I came in at just about 45 minutes.
Pretty impressive, thank you.
Not a bad estimate.
Very, very good. Are you ready to go straight away?
Well, I think so, sir, because I think we're going to be tied to
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, Mr. Cannock, if we don't finish, we'll just have to accept that we have a situation which is a rather unfortunate situation where Mr. Coleman, is in restriction overnight.
I'm grateful for that, sir, because what I don't want is to sort of artificially.
No. I think.
Don't want you to rush.
Yeah. I think that particularly with these new rules that have now been introduced, this new guidance where people are under restrictions as soon as they take the stand, it seems to me that gives much less flexibility in terms of people not being under restriction. So if it comes to it, I mean, there's a limit, frankly, to the amount of information one can take in. As I said in opening, I'm not a fan of late night sitting for inquiries, because I just find levels of concentration begin to dip. So I'm more than happy for you to, take the time you need, and we'll see how we get on. I mean, I was hoping also to have a mid-afternoon break at some point. So, I mean, perhaps we can have a break at a suitable juncture, as it were.
Well, by all means, so I'm happy to do what I can to assist you, and if it assists Mr. Coleman, the answer to all of my questions is yes. And if we do that, we'll make that appropriate.
I mean, the other thing, of course, is there's only one witness for the council, so it's inevitable that you've probably got a lot of questions to ask him. If we had a whole series of council witnesses, then that so it's inevitable that Mr. Coleman, as it were, will be answering a lot of questions, I imagine. So, okay, if you'd like to proceed, Mr. Canuck, thank you.
Mr. Coleman, just a couple of questions about your instruction, please. You ceased working for this authority in 2016, didn't you?
Yes, that's correct.
You had no involvement in the validation or assessment of the application, did you?
No, none whatsoever.
You had no role in the officer's report and the recommendation for approval, did you?
No, none whatsoever.
You were instructed after members had resolved to refuse planning permission contrary to the officer recommendation, weren't you?
Correct, yes.
Now, turn if you need to the statement of common ground, but we can agree that at the time of the determination by members, there were no outstanding requests for further information, were there?
No, that's correct.
There was no criticism of the scope or method of any of the technical assessments, was there?
No, correct.
There was no objection from statutory consultees, was there?
All objections have been overcome, as I understand it.
Yeah,
yes.
there were no technical objections to the application from anyone, in fact, were there?
No.
There was no criticism of the technical assessments at all, was there?
No.
No competing technical assessments?
Correct, yes. None.
And the recommendation for approval was the recommendation of the case officer, Mr. March, endorsed by the Director of Service Delivery, correct?
Correct.
And you have no criticism of the officer report in your evidence, do you?
No, not explicitly, no.
No, I get the point that you disagree with the conclusion. At the time of the determination, then, there was a powerful consensus of professional evidence, unanimous in supporting the scheme, wasn't there?
There was.
And it's reasonable to attach significant weight to that consensus reached in accordance with practice set out in the MPPF, isn't it?
I take a very different view to that of the officer who wrote the report, particularly in terms of how the weight that was attributed to the development plan and the role that the development plan had in the determination of the application.
Okay, the reason for refusal, you have it in your evidence at 2.4, please. And we know that reasons for refusal must be full and state clearly and precisely the full reasons for refusal, mustn't they?
Yes.
And you don't suggest that the authority has failed to comply with that statutory duty, do you?
No, I do not.
And so if I look at it, what it's saying is the proposal was not considered sustainable development by reason solely of its location outside the settlement boundary, correct?
It depends on your reading of that reason for refusal.
Well, it's not possible.
It's because it's contrary to the policies of the local development plan.
Well, let's do it in stages. It says, by reason of its location outside of the settlement boundary, it does not represent sustainable development. So the sole reason for it not being sustainable development is its location outside the settlement boundary, correct?
I think the reason for refusal needs to be looked at as a whole, because it goes on to talk about the adverse impacts of the proposal, that they would outweigh the benefits, and that being contrary to the stated policies of the Malden Local Development Plan.
Yeah, it says accordingly, so that is, accordingly is referring to the settlement boundary point, the adverse impacts would outweigh any benefits, correct? I don't see anything in there other than the location outside the settlement boundary, do I?
I think you need to, I believe it needs to be read as a whole, and I believe it's talking about the location outside of the settlement boundary does not therefore represent sustainable development, and the proposal would not outweigh the benefits of the development, and that is as a whole contrary to those policies of the local development plan.
Yes, it's because of its location outside the settlement boundaries that the adverse impacts outweigh the benefits, and that represents the conflict with policies S1, S2 and S8, correct?
Yes, it's contrary to those policies.
And so I see then in the reason for refusal, which clearly and precisely sets out the full reasons for refusal, no reference to the identity and character of the settlement, do I?
That's within policy S1.
Yes, and I don't see any other adverse land use consequence which might flow from a location on the other side of the settlement boundary, do I?
Well, I believe that there are...
So let's start with a yes or no. I don't see any reference in the reason for refusal which clearly and precisely sets out the full reasons for refusal, any reference to any adverse land use consequence which might flow from a location on the other side of the settlement boundary, do I?
No, not explicitly, no, correct.
So let's turn then please to the development plan, CD 3.1. And the development plan is the Malden Local Development Plan 2014 to 2029, isn't it?
Yes, correct.
And it was adopted in 2017 and it's more than 5 years old, isn't it?
It was approved by the Secretary of State. It wasn't adopted by the Council.
Yes, and it runs for a 15-year period between 2014 and 2029, doesn't it?
Yes, correct.
And we see, in fact, that point, it's at 119. The inspector submitted his report directly to the Secretary of State who approved the plan on the 21st of July 2017, correct?
Yes.
Right. Now, if I ask you to turn, please, to policy S2, and that's on page 17 of the PDF. So policy, it's hard copy page 17,
Yeah.
PDF page 21. What this is setting out is a minimum requirement of 4,650 units, 2014 to 2029, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
And that's a minimum of 310 dwellings per annum, isn't it?
Yes.
And if I just ask you to turn to the inspector's report, please, CD 316. I have the report of Inspector Simon Barclay dated the 29th of June 2017. Do you have that?
Yes, I have that.
And could you find, please, paragraph 61? And that's on page 13 of 55.
Yes.
And so what happened is there was a draft report which set out a housing requirement of 294 dwellings per annum. Sorry, sir. Oh, apologies, sir. Paragraph 61, page 13.
Fine, thank you.
Apologies, sir. I was keeping my eye on Mr. Coleman. So the draft policy had set out a requirement of 294, hadn't it? And the council proposed to modify this to a requirement of 4650, 310 dwellings per annum, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And the reason for that essentially is twofold. Firstly, if one looks at paragraph 62, because out-migration from London was likely to increase over the planned period, correct?
Correct.
And secondly, if one looks at paragraph 63, the second and more fundamental reason related to the plan's aspirations for economic growth and job creation, didn't it?
Yes, I would add though that there's further context to that work which isn't in this report. I commissioned that report on behalf of the council. That came basically. This is the Assessing Malden's Housing Requirement Report, August 2014, and it was clear at the time. I'm sure you'll remember there was a lot of confusion at that point in time as to what objectively assessed needs for housing actually was and how it should be calculated. So this was a report that was commissioned during the examination process to try and provide more clarity, and it came up with an upper and a lower range for what OAN could be, and it said it would be prudent to go for the upper range for those two reasons. So just wanted to clarify, it's just a slight difference in...
Yeah, I'm not too interested in some of the weeds of that.
Sure.
I've read the report. To a certain extent, if it helps you, paragraph 65 of the inspector refers to the 257 DPA being the unrounded OAN. I'm not too interested, as it were, about the household projections. Ultimately, what happened is, because of what was then called a stage 2 assessment, there was a plan aspiration for economic growth and job creation, and there was an aim, and the aim is extant in policy E1 to create a minimum of 2,000 net additional jobs by 2029, wasn't there?
That's correct.
And that does remain the extant minimum job creation in policy E1, doesn't it?
It does.
And so the approach taken by the council, endorsed by the inspector, was that there should be a minimum of 310 dwellings per annum, which was necessary to support that level of economic growth, correct?
Correct, yes.
And the figure, if one looks at paragraph 65, the figure of the unrounded OAN would lead to an inadequate working age population, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so if I look then, please, at paragraph 65, it was on that basis that the inspector concluded the figure of 310 dwellings per annum was both necessary and justified, correct?
Correct.
And we can agree that that figure of 310 dwellings per annum then is a minimum requirement, isn't it?
It is.
To support a required workforce against a minimum economic growth and job creation policy requirement, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
If I turn then, please, to policy S2, so back to CD 3.1. So PDF page 21 of CD 3.1, and policy S2 then was identifying a minimum of 4,650 and a supply of 5,108, wasn't it?
Yes, correct.
And if I scroll through to the table on the next page, I see that that supply comprised completions, extant planning permissions, allocations at Malden, Heybridge, Burnham on Crouch, an allowance from NDPs, neighbourhood plans, and a modest windfall allowance, correct?
Yes.
And then the spatial distribution of that supply in policy S2, and if it helps you look at 227, the spatial distribution was essentially twofold. Firstly, the policy sought to contain the majority of housing within and adjacent to main settlements, didn't it?
Yes.
And then secondly, if one looks at 229, a small proportion of growth was allocated to the district's rural villages to help maintain sustainable rural communities, correct?
Correct.
And there was then that 100-unit allowance in the NDP allowance, correct?
Correct.
And then if we think about the settlement boundaries then, because in that context, the settlement boundaries were drawn tightly around the existing settlements as they were in 2014 and the proposed allocations, weren't they?
Yes.
And so the role of the settlement boundaries was essentially twofold. Firstly, to provide an area inside of which housing was prima facie acceptable to meet the minimum housing requirement.
Yes.
And secondly, an area outside of which housing was in principle not acceptable, subject to the restrictions, the restricted exceptions in S8, because it wasn't needed to meet the minimum housing requirement. Correct?
Yes.
And so the spatial strategy to 2029 was very simple. Firstly, promote housing inside the settlement boundaries and on the allocations at the three main settlements. Secondly, restrict housing in the lower tier settlements, save through NDPs. And thirdly, restrict market housing as a spatial approach outside settlement boundaries. Correct?
Yes.
And that restriction on market housing outside settlement boundaries was without a consideration of their merits, wasn't it, in policy terms?
Yes, but there was consideration through the plan examination process of a larger allowance for rural allocations. That I can't remember the quantum. I think it was 300 homes. I need to check, but that ended up not being taken into the final approved plan because the district did not have a 5-year land supply, and because of the extensive examination which went on for 2 to 3 years, a lot of windfall schemes or schemes came forward outside of settlement boundaries, which essentially used up that allowance before the plan could be approved.
Okay.
So that's why that just wanted to clarify why the thing.
No, I understand. I don't want to get wrapped up in the different spatial growth options that were considered as part of the plan. We've got the plan here, but thank you for that context. Settlement hierarchy, then, please. Page 49 of the PDF. We have policy S8, and if I look at paragraph 2.102, I see the settlement hierarchy categories, don't I?
Yes,
And Latchingdon was classified as a smaller village, wasn't it?
it was. Yes,
That is essentially a matter of planning judgment, isn't it?
it was based on evidence together with planning judgment. Yes.
Yeah. And if one looks at 2.104, it was a planning judgment expressed against the evidence contained in the third bullet point, the Malden District Rural Facilities Survey, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And if I then look at compliance with the development plan in that context and just go back to policy S1, so S1 on page 18, in the terms of policy S1-2, the most sustainable locations are the three largest settlements, aren't they?
Yes.
In terms of paragraph 3, that's referring to development on previously developed land and then the planned growth at the garden suburbs and the allocations, correct?
Correct.
Right. So what 2 and 3 are doing is directing housing to allocations at the three largest settlements, isn't it?
Yes, all within settlement boundaries. Yes.
Right. Now, I'm going to come back to this separately, but paragraph 12. Paragraph 12 isn't precluding greenfield development, is it? Isn't it? Because that would be inconsistent with the framework, correct?
It's not. Yes, you're correct.
Yeah. And it's not, I don't think, a no harm policy, because that would also be inconsistent with the framework, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Right. So the issue in paragraph 12 is whether proposal has an unacceptable impact on the identity, whatever that may be, of Latchingdon, correct?
Yes.
And if I look next then, please, I'll come to the substance of that towards the end of the cross-examination. But policy S2 then, please. this then we see in the first paragraph is focusing development on the district's 3 main settlements, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's telling us in the third paragraph that the majority of new growth will be developed through SUEs, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And a proportion of new development will be directed to the rural villages to support rural needs, correct?
Yes.
But actually, we need really to read and interpret and apply policy S2 and S8 together, don't we?
With S7 as well.
Okay. But there's no evidence to suggest that this proposal will prejudice the delivery of the LDP in the terms of S2, is there?
Do you mean in terms of the further points?
Yeah, there's
on
no
S2?
evidence that any allocated site will not deliver because of this proposal.
No,
That's
there
not
isn't.
a point.
No.
Thank you. And so then, if I look at policy S8 then, please. What the policy in S8 is doing, page 49, is restricting development to sites within settlement boundaries, isn't it?
No, it's saying which development, what types of development can happen outside of settlement boundaries.
Okay, let's put it this way. Outside settlement boundaries, there can be no harm to the intrinsic character and beauty of the open countryside, correct?
Correct.
And you need to meet one of the criterion, correct?
Yes, correct.
Right, and so this is a no harm policy, isn't it? No harm to the intrinsic character and beauty, yeah?
Well, it's saying in principle, this type of development shouldn't happen regardless of whether there's harm or not.
Yeah, and that approach, that was the approach of PPS 7 and not the NPPF in what we now see paragraph 180A and 180B, isn't it? No harm to the character and beauty of the open countryside was the PPS 7 approach. It's not the approach of the NPPF 2012 or the latest version of the NPPF, is it?
I'd need to go back and read that to make sure, but I as I said, I'm comfortable that this policy approach remains consistent with the NPPF. And it was found to be so at the examination.
Okay, well, I'll perhaps touch on that again a bit later and pick it up with Mr. Armstrong if you're not sure what PPS 7 was saying. It's impossible for market housing to comply with policy S8 unless it's allocated, isn't it?
Or within a neighboured plan.
Yes.
Yes.
Which again is an allocation.
It is an allocation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it also follows then that it is impossible for a mixed market and affordable housing scheme to comply with policy S8, isn't it?
There are a number of elements of S8 that could involve forms of residential development. I don't think, I think you're correct. I don't think
thanks.
that, a residential-led scheme, market residential-led scheme would not comply.
And that, ignore the first part, that second part, a mixed market and affordable scheme can't comply. That's a purely spatial restriction, uninfluenced by a consideration of the merits or the impacts of a proposal, isn't it?
That's the spatial strategy approach, yes.
And so we can agree then, in concluding and agreeing that there's conflict with the development plan, there's no requirement or scope to consider the need for market housing, is there?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so we've gone through, let's just look at S8 in isolation. I conclude that there's conflict with S8, and in doing that, I do that without considering whether there's a need for market housing, don't I?
Yes.
Without considering the need for affordable housing as well, correct?
Yes.
Without considering the affordability of housing.
Correct.
Without considering the need for specialist accommodation for older people.
Correct.
Without considering economic benefits.
Correct.
Without considering the accessibility of the site or the sustainability of the settlement.
Correct.
Without considering the actual landscape and visual impact or the acceptability of it.
Correct.
or considering any form of planning balance at all.
That's correct, but I would point you towards policy S7, which does allow for those considerations through the purposes of a neighbourhood plan to make allocations outside of settlement boundaries.
Okay. Well, there's no conflict with S7, and we're not in a neighbourhood plan. It is what I might reasonably characterise as a computer says no approach to development management, isn't it?
I wouldn't agree with that. I think it's saying in principle how a proposal of this nature is not going to be acceptable outside of the settlement boundaries.
Yeah. Okay. And the reason for that is because at the time it wasn't considered that there was a need. It's that straightforward.
There wasn't a need for additional housing, and there are also considerable constraints. So there are risks to how much housing can be planned.
Let's look then next, please, at the performance or the relative success of that spatial strategy. Could you pick up, please, the appendix to Mr. Armstrong, Appendix 1. And if you could find, please,
Sorry, Mr. Armstrong, he had a proof. Does he have
separately bound appendices, yeah. Have you got that, Mr. Coleman?
Yes.
Yeah. Have we got spare copies? And yes, and you've done what I always do, so which is to stick a post-it note in it, and then that shows that you've read it. Stamp a couple of coffee marks on it as well. Okay, so I just want to interrogate really the performance of the spatial strategy then in the context of the agreement we've reached. And if you could find, please, mine's got page 10 and page 15 on it. I'm not sure why, but if you could find page 10 and 15,
So,
section 5. So it's the technical
I've
name.
numbered these actually,
Yeah.
different appendices. We're looking at
1.
One. And it's
Page 10, I think.
10.
It's section 5.
That's section 3.
Oh, we'll keep going. So then it's black page 15, if that.
Yeah, there seems to be two
Yes.
systems.
I think because you've got the internal one and you've got Mr. Armstrong's,
Yeah.
but at least we've got some numbers, which is better than normal. Okay, well I'll go by the black numbers because, in fairness to Mr. Armstrong, I think that they go continuously through.
Yeah. So we're on page 15, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And what we note from 5.1 is that at the EIP, the authority claimed a 5-year supply, didn't it?
Yes, correct.
But what we see from 5.2 is that very quickly it became clear that the authority couldn't demonstrate a 5-year supply, didn't it?
Yes.
Because April 2020, 4.9 years, April 2021, 3.26 years, April 2022, 3.66 years, correct?
Yeah, so it's 3 years afterwards, after the approval.
And if we look at the completions, please, which is table 4.1, so just go back a couple of pages to page 11. And these are agreed in the Statement of Common Ground, but I just want to try and stick in one document if I can. What we saw in the first 5 years of the plan, so table 4.1, in the first 5 years of the plan to 2019 was a 536 unit shortfall, correct?
Correct.
And as you went through with my learned friend, we now have 109 unit shortfall against the minimum housing requirement of the plan, correct?
Correct.
And what one sees at 4.2 is that against the trajectory, a shortfall of 914 units, correct?
Yes, correct.
Which is broadly equivalent to 3 full years' supply, isn't it?
Broadly, yes.
And that's a very significant shortfall against the planned trajectory, against a minimum requirement, isn't it?
I think you need to look at the 109 figure rather than the cumulative. You look at how the plan is performing as a whole. The trajectory is important, but the longer you move away from adoption or approval, the less reliance you can have on individual years of an individual planning housing trajectory, I would say.
Okay. Now, the reason for the significant shortfall is because of a significant failure in the allocations to deliver as claimed, isn't it?
In part, yes, but I think that's caused in part by a global pandemic, amongst other issues.
Well, if we look at table 4.3, we see, don't we? I mean, one has to be fair. Just go back. I'm not really sure. This new point was raised by the councillor and picked up by you. We're talking about the pandemic. What, from sort of March 2020?
It's not a new point. It was in my statement of case.
Okay, but the pandemic starting when? March 2020, around then? Have I got my dates correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. So up until March 2020, just go back to table 4.1. What we see, in fact, is a failure to deliver against the minimum housing requirement in 5 out of the first 6 years, don't we?
Yes, but the examination was ongoing for 4 of those first 5 years.
Yes, which, if I may say so, makes it all the more extraordinary that the trajectory has been so violently askew when, from 2017, you're 332 units out, and then 2019, 192 units out, because you're only predicting 24 months in advance, aren't you?
Sorry, I don't understand that point.
Okay. Just go back to table 4.3. The reason for the significant shortfall is because of the significant failure in the allocations to deliver as projected, correct, or as planned?
Yes, they haven't delivered as planned, correct.
And there is an agreed, table 4.3, 910 unit shortfall against the allocated sites, isn't there?
In terms of their specific individual trajectories, yes.
Right. And then if I look, please, at table 4.4, what you have then pointed out to the inspector in your examination in chief is, but performance has improved more recently, correct?
Correct.
Right. What we see, in fact, then, over the last 5 years, is 633 units being granted on windfall sites, don't we?
Correct.
That's 32% of the total completions, isn't it?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Right. And so if one looks at 4.6, what we see is there was a planned windfall allowance of 23 dwellings per annum, but in fact an average delivery of 127 dwellings on windfall sites, correct?
Correct.
Right. And that includes greenfield sites outside settlement boundaries, doesn't it?
It does, because of the tilted balance being applied.
Yeah. And so what we can agree is that the plan has significantly failed to deliver the minimum number of required houses as planned, hasn't it?
Yes, but that I would strongly suggest that global economic conditions have had a significant role in that. Not the only reason, but a significant reason for that.
It's very helpful, thank you. Now, what we know then is that there's a statutory and national policy requirement to review the plan every 5 years, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
And just turn up, please, the statement of common ground. So this is the main statement of common ground at 7.9. Do you have that electronically, sir?
We'll just get that electronically.
Yeah.
I think I had a paper copy of the housing land one, but not the...
So that is CD 9.3.
CD 9.3. Right, thank you.
And if you could find, please, Mr. Coleman, page 15, paragraph 7.9.
Yes.
And if you just read 7.9 and footnote 3, it's agreed that the council has carried out a review and determined that an update is required, hasn't it?
Yes.
And that's what's meant by update is a statutory update in accordance with the terms of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, correct?
Yes.
So that's a statutory process, isn't it?
Yes.
And if you turn, please, to CD 5.9. CD 5.9.
Sorry, what's the name of the document?
It's a technical briefing paper to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee.
CD 5.9.
Yes, please, CD 5.9. Because I want to examine and try and agree with you the reasons for the need for an update to the plan.
Sorry, just bear with me a second.
So this is the overview and scrutiny.
Correct, sir, thank you.
This is 5-year housing land supply paper.
Yeah, so it's a technical briefing paper from the authority's lead planning policy officer to the authority's Overview and Scrutiny Committee dated July 2022, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm struggling to find that.
Okay, everyone got it? And if one finds, please...
Sorry, just bear with
Yeah.
me a minute.
Does everyone have it? Sorry.
I've got it, I'm just waiting on Mr. Coleman, sir.
Oh, it's a laptop failure.
No, just trying to find the document, sorry. Okay, sorry, I have that, yes.
Have you got it? And if you just look at 1.1, what essentially the officer is interrogating is why there's been a failure to deliver sufficient homes to meet the government's minimum requirement for a 5-year supply, what's proposed to resolve the difficulty, and what the impact is on the local development plan and the impending review, correct?
Correct.
And if one looks at 5.1, please, we see the trajectory set out, don't we?
Yes.
At 5.2, please, and could you find the second paragraph in the bullet point that begins, however, the trajectory was nevertheless ambitious?
Yes.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
So there's a recognition that the trajectory was ambitious, yes? And next bullet point that one of the sites at least should be removed, correct? Are you with me?
I am, I'm just reading it, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Well, it says if the examination were happening now, it is probable that the site would be removed by the inspector.
Yeah.
But that's the officer's view.
Yeah.
So just so I'm clear on this document, I can't see a date on it.
I said July 2022.
July 2022. So this was, it just says Appendix A, briefing only on scrutiny committee. There doesn't seem to be any date on it, but unless I'm missing it. I mean, if that's right, Mr. Cameron, then I'll take your word for it.
Well, I don't want to give evidence, but nor do I tend to, nor do I just tend to completely make stuff up. So can we try and just resolve that outside the inquiry?
I mean, I just wanted to be clear that obviously these comments that are being made about difficulties and,
The context
how we
of
got
it.
to this present difficulty and so on. I just wanted to be clear. I'm not sure what. What's that? I wonder.
It's on that laptop.
Yeah, but whose laptop?
The streaming works through a laptop.
Oh, I see.
Yes, yes.
Sounds like somebody's unplugged it if it's making that
So
sound.
where I think I've taken that from is if you find Mr. Armstrong's evidence,
Yeah.
page 19 and footnote 14. That's got the date of 28th of July 2022 on it.
So we're looking at page 18. Did you say?
19.
19.
So, of Mr. Armstrong.
Right. Okay, and that's the 28th of July 2022. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Fine. Thank you. I mean, I assume that's correct. If Mr. Armstrong has, I've no reason to say that that's not the correct date. So these comments relate to the situation in 2022 then?
Correct.
Paragraph 1.1, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, and so what we then just looked at 5.1, it sets out the trajectory.
Yes.
5.2, comment about the trajectory being ambitious. And then if one looks at 5.4, we see at that time the strategic sites have delivered 32% of their housing trajectory, which left a shortfall of 67% or approximately 919 homes. And we've looked at the updated position, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then if we just look at the problems, the officer is saying LDP should be flexible enough to accommodate additional housing growth if it's needed to come forward in between reviewing plans. This is called windfall housing development, and it should feed the supply with extra housing when needed. Alongside the slower pace of delivery of the strategic sites, there are several other contributing factors to the council not having a 5-year housing supply. And those factors are set out. But the essential recognition or diagnosis is that the plan is inflexible or not adequately flexible. Is that fair?
That was that officer's view reflected. It's
Yeah.
not a view I share, but
No.
that's their view.
But we're then told that there are several other contributing factors. The first is that there was no policy setting out how the windfall allowance was be delivered, correct?
Can I just ask where you are in the document?
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't see.
So 5.5,
Yes.
and that talks about several other contributing factors. And then the first contributing factor is in the first bullet point.
Okay.
And it says there was no policy setting out how the windfall allowance was be delivered. And that's right, there is no policy setting out how the windfall allowance was be delivered, was there?
I'm not aware of there being policies in,
No.
certainly not local plans I've been involved in, which have a policy of that nature. And I would like to also just say again that the windfall allowance and the neighbour plan allowance was largely used up just before the examination had concluded, which is why the numbers are quite relatively low.
Okay, the next point that's made is that the policies are not written very clearly compared to more recent local plans. They may have many constraining caveats which are repeated throughout the LDP, making it difficult for developers to gain planning permission. That's the second point, isn't it?
Again, that's the officer's view. It's not one I agree with at all.
The third point is the settlement boundaries effectively squeeze out nearby opportunities for windfall development within those boundaries or just outside, and any other housing development is generally refused as being in the open countryside. This is even when it's adjacent to existing settlements and could be considered acceptable in all other considerations. So what the officer's saying is we're having problems here because of an inflexibility in the application of the settlement boundary policy, which is having the effect of refusing otherwise sustainable proposals, correct?
That's what yes, essentially that's what
Yeah.
the officer is saying. I don't agree with the statement.
And then it said that the settlement hierarchy was based on out-of-date evidence, and evidence which wasn't robust because there were no site visits and the evidence simply came from the parish council. And the effect of that is that applications are being refused in settlements which could now be considered to be sustainable, correct?
Again, that's what it says, but I don't agree with that position. I think it's
Right.
fundamentally actually incorrect.
And then lastly, it's saying all of this means bringing forward any development outside the strategic sites is difficult, correct?
Yes.
And nowhere does the officer, trying to give a robust, independent, objective analysis of why the supply at that point was problematic and there was no 5-year supply, referred to recessionary factors or the pandemic or any of those issues, correct?
Again, yes, correct, but I don't agree with their analysis.
Right. Next, please. In terms then of what is proposed in this report, we're told that there are several actions that the council can take to resolve, and one of them was to carry out a review of the LDP and allocate additional housing, wasn't it?
Yes, where are you, sorry, in the document?
So paragraph 8.1.
Okay, yes.
So the first action was to carry out a review and allocate additional housing, yeah?
Yes.
And if you look then at the fifth point, that was to ensure that the policies in the reviewed LDP are less constrained, more positively written for housing growth, and flexible in line with the updated national policy. So effectively what the officer is saying is, don't have what I've characterised and you've disagreed with as this computer says no approach, where you have mixed market and affordable housing outside settlement boundaries and just say no to them. It's saying that you should have more positively written policies for housing growth, correct?
That's what the officer is saying.
Yeah.
Again, I don't agree with it, but that's their view.
No. So what I want to do then next, please, is look at the material considerations, and it might be that that's a logical place for a break. So, sir, I've done my bit on the development plan and how the development plan is done, and what the council have said about that, and now I'm going to move on to the material considerations that we say outweigh that agreed conflict. So if that's clear where everyone is, that might be an appropriate point.
Yes. To break. I mean, in terms of your progress, Mr. Cannock, about halfway through.
Because we remember, yes.
Well, I mean, I think we've been going. Mr. Coleman started his cross-examination shortly after 2, wasn't it? Just after 2. So you're not. I think you're doing quite well, really. It's only.
Well, I'll ask those instructed me to make a note of that. So.
In terms of speed, yes. No, I mean, I didn't mean anything derogatory, Mr. Cannock. I mean, no. I was meaning you're sticking to your timetable. I don't comment on these matters. Anyway, yeah, no, that sounds like a good idea. Let's break. I don't know whether this will. Yeah.
I'm on support ready. Yeah.
Excellent. So if we break, let's come back about. Shall we say we'll come back at 3:15? Is that okay? We'll adjourn until 3:15. Obviously, you can't discuss your evidence with anyone. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. We will resume the public inquiry, and Mr. Cannock was midway through his cross-examination of the council's witness, Mr. Coleman. So I'll allow Mr. Cannock to continue with his cross-examination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So, material considerations. The first one then, the need for market housing. We agree that there's a 5-year supply of 5.97 years, don't we?
Yes.
A 5-year supply is the minimum requirement of the framework against a minimum housing requirement, isn't it?
Yes, correct.
And we agree the local housing need figure using the standard method is 279 dwellings per annum, don't we?
Yes.
And that's lower than the extant annualised requirement of 310 dwellings per annum, which is required to be the minimum requirement for minimum economic growth, correct?
Yes, but objectively assessed needs, yes.
Okay, and so then if I could ask you to go back to the technical note, Mr. Armstrong's Appendix 1, and find table 5.3 on page 21. So page 21, Mr. Armstrong, Appendix 1. And if I ask you to find in table 3, we had what was the council's position and the appellant's position, and now we've agreed the appellant's position. So the 5-year supply is 1665, correct?
Yes, correct.
And if we look at 5.33, of that 1665, 620 dwellings are on windfall sites, correct?
Based on Mr. Armstrong's information, yes.
Yeah. And that is 620 is 37% of 1665. So the windfall sites are 37% of the future supply, correct?
It says 33% here, but yes.
Well, I think that's because of the council's supply. If you look at footnote 5, that's 620 of 1861 is 33%. If you do 620 of 1665, it's 37%.
No, yes. Okay.
And what we see at 533 is without the windfall supply, actually, it would be 4.45 years, correct?
According to this, yes.
Yeah, okay. And so then if I look at table 5.4, what we see is that of those 620, 417 are on 9 large sites, aren't they?
Yes.
And if you turn on to page 535, we see that 8 of those 9 large sites are outside the settlement boundary, correct?
Yes.
And we've got 405 dwellings on large windfall sites on greenfield sites, in addition to 118 dwellings on 71 small windfall sites located outside the settlement boundaries. So what we know is there are a total of 523 dwellings on windfall sites outside settlement boundaries. Do you agree there?
I agree, that's what it says. Yes, absolutely. It sounds right, yeah.
So we've got 31% effectively in the 5-year supply, which are contrary to the development plan. And what we know also at 536 is that in one case, the Secretary of State granted consent when a 5-year supply could be demonstrated, correct? 536.
Yes, I wasn't aware of that, but yes, according to this, yes.
Okay. So what we can agree is that the local authority can only demonstrate a minimum 5-year supply against a minimum housing requirement because of a very significant proportion of homes being consented on greenfield sites outside the settlement boundary, contrary to the spatial strategy of the plan, can't we?
Because the tilted balance was applied for a number of years, hence schemes coming forward on windfall sites. As I have stated, I believe that there was a number of factors restricting the strategic allocations, which has led to them not delivering as anticipated, but they are now delivering at significant speed.
Right. Well, you say significant speed. They're delivering at 1665. That's what's projected for the next 5 years. Yeah, that's agreed.
Yes, in terms
Yeah.
of that quantum, yes.
Yes. Okay. So what we can see, though, from table 5.5, which is then the future 5 years supply position, we see that the housing supply is set to fall based even on the authority's flawed trajectory, correct?
That's what that's
Yeah.
what the table says. I'm not sure of all the basis for the numbers, but
What it's telling us at 540 is that further windfall sites, so that's greenfield sites outside settlement boundaries, are going to be required if the council is to maintain a minimum 5-year supply. That's quite clear, isn't it? And has been clear for the last 10 years.
it depends on the delivery of the strategic allocations and garden suburbs. It certainly has been the case historically, but those sites should be delivering higher numbers going forward than they have historically.
Okay, so let's break it down in this way. That has been the case, and it will be the case in the next 5 years, correct?
What will be, sorry? The allocations delivering more, or the
No,
windfall
sorry.
sites?
It will be the case that the local authority will be dependent on greenfield sites outside settlement boundaries to have a minimum 5-year supply.
Not additional ones, no. Not those.
No, I'm not saying additional ones, because I'm breaking it, and then I'm going to look at the future. So what we've agreed so far is the past. We've agreed the 5-year period. And it being the case that it's been the case in the past, it's been the case in the 5-year period, and we see the future 5-year supply, the trajectory going down, 23, 24, 25, it follows that it will remain the case in the future, won't it?
I don't agree, because I believe that the allocations are already increasing their delivery and will continue to do so.
Okay, I see no evidence to set against what's set out at table 5.5, do I?
No, we haven't provided specific evidence, no.
Okay, so then just in terms then of the plan period supply, turn over the page to 6.1. We have agreed that there were 2,681 dwellings completed between 2014 and 2023, correct?
Correct.
And that leaves 1,969 to be delivered from 2023 to the end of the plan period in 2029 to meet the minimum requirement, correct?
Correct.
Right. And so 1969 over 6 years, that's 328 dwellings per annum, isn't it?
Yes.
And if, as we know, we've got a residual of 1669 and we've got 1665 in the 5-year supply, that leaves a residual of 304 units, correct?
Yeah, I obviously haven't got those numbers, but yes.
Thank you. And so, I mean, I will just put it once, but when the plan figure is a minimum and the 5-year supply is a minimum requirement, it's unanswerable, isn't it, that the benefits of delivering more market housing is a material consideration of significant weight in the context of an NPPF imperative to boost significantly the supply of new homes, isn't it?
No, not at all costs.
Well, I'm not saying at all costs. I've got to balance this against the conflict with the development plan, but look at it in isolation.
That's where the tilted balance comes in.
Well, I know, I'm not asking. I'm about the weight just to be attached to the benefits of delivering market housing. If I've got an imperative to boost significantly the supply, and the plan figures a minimum, the 5-year supply is a minimum requirement, the benefits of delivering more market housing is a material consideration of significant weight in this case, isn't it?
No, I don't agree.
Next, please, the need for affordable housing. Proposal of 160 homes, 80 of which will be affordable, correct?
Yes, correct.
And if I just ask you to turn, please, to CD 3.1. And so, can I say, when I get an answer like that, I feel like I've put my point. It's a fairly simple point, and you'll be more than capable of making a judgment. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time bashing people over the head. And I'm assuming you're just taking that as read.
I appreciate, Mr. Cannock, that
There's a degree of
I very
brevity
much
here.
endorse your. There's no point in spending a long time, and then I'm not no criticism of the witness either.
No,
you know,
we disagree.
I have to just make a judgment on these things where there's a disagreement.
You've got the evidence now, and now that's the ultimate judgment.
Thank you.
So, need for affordable housing, CD 3.1, policy H1 on page 82 of the PDF. No, that's not right. Sorry, apologies. It's it.
I have H1 on page 82.
It's 82 of the hard copy as well.
Is it 80? Okay. I don't know quite how that's changed, but anyway, there we go. Yeah, sorry, H1. I was looking at the wrong policy. That's the problem. So right. So policy H1, and if you look at 5.2, please. The plan was identifying a significant shortage in the availability of affordable housing in 2014, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so an increase in the supply was one of the key priorities, wasn't it?
Yes.
And if one looks, please, at 5.12, we're then being told by the plan that the delivery of future housing should meet the needs and aspirations of people requiring market and affordable housing, because that's a vital part of creating sustainable communities, correct?
Correct.
And the evidence base was the SHMA 2012, wasn't it?
Correct.
Now, we can agree that policy H1 doesn't set out an affordable housing requirement as such, does it?
No, it does not.
What it's doing is it's trying to deliver a percentage of market homes as affordable homes, correct?
Correct.
And if I just look at CD 316, please. So the inspector's report, CD 316. And could you find, please, paragraph 127 of the inspector's report? What we see is the inspector identifying a net need for affordable housing of 130 dwellings per annum, correct?
Correct.
And we expected strategic allocations to deliver around half of the affordable units needed, correct?
Correct.
And it was on that basis that the inspector had some reasonable degree of confidence about the affordable housing figures, correct?
Correct.
And then at paragraph 129, we see some other sources of potential supply, but the contribution from rural exception schemes was not large, correct?
Correct.
And then if I look at 130, the inspector concluded that there was on that basis a reasonable prospect that the need for affordable housing could be met, correct?
Yes. Correct.
Could you pick up, please, the evidence of Mr. Roberts? And could you find, please, 5.8 on page 21? And I'm doing this for convenience. We can go to the document if necessary, but I don't want to. The 2014 SHMA identified a need of 201 affordable homes 2014 to 2019, didn't it?
Yes. Why? But are you going to explain the difference in the?
Yes, and then it was 149 over 15 years, and the difference between the two figures was a difference depending on how quickly the backlog was cleared, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and then the 130 figure referred to by the inspector didn't take account of the backlog, correct?
As I understand it, yes.
Brilliant. So then next, please, the latest objective evidence is from the Council's Local Housing Needs Assessment, May 2021, isn't it?
Correct.
And if you turn please to 519, that is setting out, so 519, that's setting out a need of 174 social affordable rented homes per annum, and then 35 affordable homes for ownership, a total of 209 affordable homes per annum, 2020 to 2040, correct?
Correct.
And that's 4,180 homes over a 20-year period, isn't it?
Yes.
And if one looks at 521, in that context, the Council's Housing Needs Assessment acknowledged a notable need for affordable housing, correct?
Correct.
And also that it was an important and pressing issue, and that therefore housing delivery should be maximised where opportunities arise, correct?
Correct.
And the reality is that this need will be met on viable, greenfield, market home sites because there's limited scope for res schemes, correct?
No, I don't agree.
Well, how else is it going to be met other than on viable greenfield sites through market homes delivery?
Through the allocations in the plan, together with whatever the council decides to do in the future through its LDP review.
So allocations and LDP review. Through the LDP review, it is unanswerable that this local authority will be significantly dependent on greenfield sites outside settlement boundaries, won't it?
Well, it's inevitable that there will be
Yeah.
new further allocations required in the future, yes, but that's for the council to determine.
Right, understood. In terms of delivery, could you turn to Mr. Roberts' figure 6.1? So figure 6.1, it's page 25. We see a total, do you see the middle column? Sorry, so figure 6.1, page 25. Page 25. We see a total of 581 additions in the plan period, don't we?
Yes.
And that's an average of 65 net per annum, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Which is less than half the need for 154, correct?
Correct.
Right. And then at figure 6.2, we see in respect of affordable housing delivery, so table figure 6.2 on page 26, I see significant shortfalls annually, don't I?
Not always significant, but certainly shortfalls, yes.
And a very significant cumulative shortfall, don't
Yeah,
I?
yes.
And a shortfall of 805 units, that's over 5 years supply. That shortfall is very significant, isn't it?
Yes, but it needs to be also considered in a national context of a shortage of affordable housing, a crisis nationally. So yes, I don't say it isn't significant, but it is also a national trend for affordable housing need to be growing and shortfalls to be growing.
Okay, I'm not going to fence with you. I mean, it doesn't become less significant just because it might be worse elsewhere, does it?
No, it doesn't.
No. Okay, so then what I see then, please, if one looks at figure 6.3, self-evidently, I see that performance is worse against the assessment of 2021, correct? And I see a shortfall of 305 occurring in just 3 years, so around 50% of the need again, correct?
Where are you referring to, sorry?
So, sorry, figure 6.3 on page 27. This is then an assessment against the 2021 LNHA. So against the figure of 209, I see a total shortfall of 305. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And so that's about 50% of the most recently identified need being delivered, correct?
The shortfall since 2020 is 50%. Sorry, say that again.
Yeah. So the 2021 LNHA set out an annual need of 209.
Yeah.
So that's 627. The shortfall has been 305. So effectively, it's been running at about 50% of that need, correct?
Using those figures, yes.
Yeah.
But the author does acknowledge that delivery is improving and has improved since 2019. I'm not suggesting that there isn't a shortfall, but there's a positive trend.
Well, not sure that's quite true. If you look at the additions, 2021, 127, 94, 101, an average of 107. Anyway, it's fair to conclude, looking at those figures, that the delivery of affordable housing in the plan period has been abject, hasn't it?
I wouldn't use the word abject. I would say that I would certainly agree that there is a considerable need for affordable housing. I would also suggest that that is something that the plan is, if you like, doing its best to try and address. I think the scale of need is considerable, and as I've said, I think that's something that certainly I see in my work across the country is a pattern which is sadly being seen in many local authorities. But I do see, as the author of the report suggests, that there is an upward trend, which I would say is correlated with, in my opinion, with the allocations in the plan starting to now deliver at the pace that is anticipated, or more closer to the pace that's anticipated.
Well, let's have a look at that. Mr. Roberts, 7.7, please, on page 32. From the council's own estimates, there's a supply of 499 homes, which is an average of, well, it's an average of 98, actually. Yeah.
Sorry, which figure did you
So
say?
7.7.
Yeah, okay.
So the council is saying it will deliver 499 affordable homes over the next 5 years.
Yeah,
So if I divide 499 by 5, I get 98 affordable homes per annum. Yes?
yeah, correct.
Which is less than half of the need identified in the 2021 assessment, isn't it?
Yes.
So it's not doing any better in the next 5 years either, is it?
Not according to those figures, no.
No. Well, the council's own figures. I mean,
Yes.
they're not my figures. Right. And so if I look at figure 7.1, please, over the page on page 33. We see that the shortfall will increase from 805, which you agreed was very significant, to over 1,000 units with 1 year of the plan period to go, correct?
Correct.
Right. And so, respectfully, the EIP inspector's confidence was misplaced, wasn't it?
He said that, I believe the use the words reasonable prospect, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think that was his judgment to make at the time. And as I said, it's not as straightforward as just saying the plan has failed. There are a number of reasons why affordable housing delivery is not at the level it ideally should be. And the scale of affordable housing need is such in this district and in many areas that it's very difficult for a local plan to clear shortfalls through requiring market housing to provide affordable housing.
And let's be clear, the only reason why it's able to deliver 499 affordable homes in the next 5 years is because of that component, in part, of greenfield sites outside settlement boundaries, isn't it?
In part, yes.
Yeah. And so you would agree that with 1 year of the plan, a shortfall of 1,000 affordable homes demonstrates that the plan has failed, as planned, to deliver what it said it would deliver at the EIP. I mean, that's unanswerable, isn't it?
Well, it certainly hasn't achieved the levels that were anticipated, that's correct.
Okay, and then just in moving the debate on to affordability, if you look at 8.3, we see 981 households on the affordable register, don't we?
Yes.
Each one of those represents a family in urgent need, doesn't it?
Yes.
And if I look at figure 8.3, where properties are becoming available, I see bids of 50 to 1 or 101 to 1 for 1 to 2 bed homes, don't I?
Figure 8.3, yes.
And if I look at 836, I then see affordability ratios of 11.67, don't I?
Yes.
And that means in the real world that housing is unaffordable for a very significant proportion of the local population, doesn't it?
It does. Although figure 8.1 does also show that whilst the housing register, households on the housing register are very substantial, and I don't underestimate that at all, the number has decreased slightly, which could reflect, I suggest could reflect an improvement.
Well,
Appreciate that's
I think Mr. Roberts would explain it's a difference in the reporting, but anyway, I won't get hung up on that. If you look at 9.88, if you just go back, please, to 8.36. So 8.36 on page 41. So the affordability ratio is 11.67, and that's an 18% increase since the start of the LDP period in 2014. And so what we are seeing is, as a result of the failure to deliver market and affordable homes, prices are increasing, aren't they?
They are increasing. I don't have obviously the figures to compare that to the national trend, but the fact is the number of homes coming forward in this district is much higher now than it has been historically, albeit it's still, there's still an affordability issue, of course.
Yes. If your point is that greenfield sites outside settlement boundaries are boosting your supply, we agree. If you turn, please, to 3.4 on page 7. So 3.4 on page 7. What we are seeing now is that the first-time buyer ages have crept up to 40. Yeah?
Yes.
And it's characterised, and you would agree with this characterisation nationally and locally, wouldn't you, if you look at 3.3, that the delivery of affordable housing is in crisis, isn't it?
Yes.
And essentially, local planning authorities have broken the social contract with its local population, that if you work hard, you can afford your own home. That's what's happened, hasn't it?
I wouldn't label that entirely at local authorities' door, to be honest. I don't think that's a fair characterisation. But
Okay. But the consequences are, if one looks at 426, please, the council has failed its own corporate priority, hasn't it?
I wouldn't use the word failed, because I think, as I said, there are a number of factors that feed in here. And I think what the council has tried to do through the LDP, the Local Development Plan, is to substantially increase the supply. And it hasn't increased as much as it was anticipated, but it has increased beyond historic levels.
And if one looks at 318, please, what we actually see is that the affordability of housing is the main cause of homelessness, isn't it?
Yes.
And at 313, so at the top of page 9, we're now finding that over half of homeless families are in work, aren't they?
Yes.
And so if one looks, please, at 321, it's correct, isn't it, that the only way to end the affordable housing crisis is to build more social housing, isn't it?
Yes.
And you'd agree that the delivery of 80 homes is a benefit of substantial weight, wouldn't you?
I would, yes.
Thirdly, please, the need for specialist accommodation for older people. 10% are proposed as bungalows, aren't they?
Yes.
If you turn, please, to Mr. Armstrong's evidence, his main proof at 524, so 524, Mr. Armstrong, page 40. The PPG characterises the need to provide housing for older people as critical, doesn't it?
Yes.
And I don't note any calibration higher than critical, do I, in national policy or national guidance? I'm not aware of a sort of higher imperative for you.
That's not something I agree, but
Okay.
I don't know
Okay.
for sure.
And the reason it's critical is because of what we call the demographic time bomb, correct?
Yes.
And if I ask you then to look at CD 4.2, so CD 4.2, and this is the Authorities Specialist Needs Housing SPD, September 2018.
Yeah.
And what I see, if you could turn to paragraph 1.2 on page 4 of 58 on the PDF.
Yeah.
I see that 67% of the projected growth of the district's population over the next 15 years will be people aged 65 and over, correct?
Correct.
And it's considered then in this council's SPD to be a priority to ensure that the future supply of homes meets the housing needs of this group, correct?
Correct.
And so what we see is that that national demographic time bomb has a local expression in Malden, doesn't it?
Yes.
And if I ask you to turn to paragraph 1.4, the council's SPD is then telling decision makers that providing a wider choice of specialist needs and housing options better suited to their requirements is important, correct?
Correct.
And at 3.10, so if you could scroll through to 3.10 on page 16. The SPD is then telling us that it's essential that the district's housing market operates cohesively, because what happens is if older people downsize into, say, bungalows, then that frees up underutilised family homes. And each downsizer then triggers 3 further moves and releases starter homes, correct?
Correct.
And in that context, if you turn to 225, please. It's characterised in that paragraph as an acute need for specialist housing in the district, isn't it?
Yes.
And if one looks at 226 and the final bullet point of 226, it's telling us that bungalows could help meet the needs of both older people and those with specialist needs, but these are not as readily available in general housing stock and often more expensive due to their limited availability. So we can agree that the benefit of delivering 16 bungalows capable of meeting the acute need for specialist accommodation for older people is a material consideration of significant weight, isn't it?
It's certainly a benefit offered by the proposal, absolutely.
Of significant weight. I mean, Mr. Cole, I'm a little indifferent as to what you want to say it is, because the inspector will form his own view. But
Absolutely.
for reasons I've articulated, I trust tolerably clearly I say significant weight. What do you say?
I'd certainly say very difficult to say for sure, but I mean, yes, absolutely of weight. I would say of moderate weight. There are other ways other than bungalows. I'm not suggesting they're not important, but they are not the only answer.
Next then, please, could you pick up the statement of common ground at 8.2? So the statement of common ground at 8.2. And
Sorry, that's CD 9.3?
sorry, yes, let me get that for you. Yeah, I forgot to because I've got it in hard copy. It is CD 9.3.
I'm sorry, which paragraph?
Paragraph 8.2 on page 18. And so it's common ground that Latchingdon is an established village, offering a number of services and facilities, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's agreed that these facilities are all accessible by foot, cycle and public transport, correct?
Yes.
And then in terms of the sustainability of the settlement, could you turn to CD 5.6? So CD 5.6, so this is the Rural Facilities Survey and Settlement Pattern, May 2023.
Okay.
And if you just turn to paragraph 1.3, the context for this updated facilities and settlement hierarchy study was deficiencies in the previous analysis which you don't accept, correct?
It doesn't say that here, does it?
Well, what we saw is the technical review is saying that effectively no one went out on site, wasn't very accurate based on information from the parish council. And so what 1.3 is saying is, well, look, this is a much more comprehensive analysis of the settlements in the district, yeah?
Again, this is what that's saying. I oversaw the original work, and it wasn't only information from the parish councils. So this is factually incorrect.
Okay.
But yes, that's what it says here.
But let's just think about this. Where I have an analysis from 2012, where the council itself is saying it's deficient, and then I have an updated document from the council itself addressing in part those deficiencies, and it's claiming to be a much more comprehensive analysis. Where those two objective analyses conflict, it's reasonable, isn't it, to attach greater weight to this assessment?
I haven't interrogated this assessment, but yes, of course, this is a more up-to-date piece of evidence, and obviously things have changed since the last bit of evidence was done.
And it's an objective assessment, and it's intended to form a robust basis for decision-making, isn't it?
Yes.
And if I look, please, at 4.1, page 7 of 14. This 4.1, page 7, sir. Conclusion of the rural facility study.
Yeah.
Have you got it? And what that's telling me is that it's concluding that the settlements have reasonable connectivity to the higher order settlements, isn't it?
That's what it says. I don't know which settlements it's referring to.
Well, Malden, Heybridge and Burnham on Crouch, Southwood and Ferrers, Witham and Tiptree.
Okay, the settlements of the district being the villages.
And then if you turn on, please, to 5.7, and it's in the table on page 11 of 14.
Yes,
I see a definition of large village, don't I?
you do, yes.
And if I look at 5.8, please, what has been undertaken is an exercise which creates a settlement pattern in what is called a policy off baseline for the local plan review, correct?
Correct.
So this is a policy off baseline intended to be a robust basis for future decision making, isn't it?
I said I haven't interrogated the document, but I believe so.
Yeah. And so if I look at 5.10 then, what it is doing is concluding that against that updated definition, Latchingdon is a large village, correct?
That is what the study is suggesting.
Problem was it blew open.
We might be able to put it on the fence.
Oh, yeah, give it a go.
Okay, so yes, I think we agree, Mr. Coleman, that the conclusion of this objective analysis is that Latchingdon falls to be considered as a large village, correct?
That's what the study is saying, but I would highlight that when you undertake these types of exercises and produce this type of evidence, it obviously depends upon a whole host of issues, including the criteria that you use to measure, for instance, accessibility. And I don't suggest for a second that there are inaccuracies in this work, but this has not been yet subject to examination. There is, the older work you referred to was subject to examination. So yes, this may well be the direction of travel. That's absolutely the case. But at the moment, this is just that, and things may change.
I'm not sure what you mean by a direction of travel. We can draw a distinction, can't we, between policy and evidence, can't we?
Yes, absolutely.
And this can be afforded significant weight as a piece of evidence, can't we? Because it's undertaken by the council on an objective basis to inform future decision making. So it can be afforded significant weight as a piece of evidence, not policy, correct?
It's rare I think you would afford significant weight to evidence. It's informing the policy production. There may be other issues which are taken into account, which mean that the council do not decide to designate Latchingdon as a large village.
Sorry, I'm not talking about future policy. I'm just talking about Latchington and its sustainability. And all I'm saying is this document has provided, council's document, a definition of larger settlement, and Latchington is considered to be a larger settlement on the basis of a 2023 analysis, isn't it?
Yeah, on the basis of the criteria that they've decided to use.
Yes.
And the analysis that they've undertaken, yes.
And in fact, on this analysis, it's the fourth most sustainable large village, isn't it?
According to this analysis, yes.
And if I look then, please, at CD 5.2, CD 5.2, so this then is the Reg 18 document, the issues and options. If you find, please, page 22. So page 22, we see that the issues and options document proposes to recategorise Latchingdon as a large village, doesn't it?
Yes.
And it's reasonable to attach limited weight to this as a piece of policy, isn't it?
I wouldn't attach... I think it's reasonable to attach limited weight to it as a piece of evidence emerging, as a piece of work that's emerging. But there are, I've noted, the reason I hesitate is because I have noted in my proof that there are objections to this work and to this redesignation, including from Essex County Council, and that work is clearly ongoing to look at these issues. So very limited weight in terms of the position that this sets out now. prior to further work being undertaken, the objections that have been received, and then ultimately examination. So things, as we all know, can change considerably.
But what we know is the council has undertaken an objective analysis. We've seen the conclusions, and then what we know has happened is the Reg 18 document has gone before members to be approved before being published for Reg 18 consultation. So the members have decided that Latchingdon should be, at this stage, recategorised on the basis of that evidence. That's correct, isn't it?
I wasn't at the meeting where members debated or decided that, but yeah, technically
That's
they have approved the document for consultation. That doesn't mean that they won't necessarily change their minds. I don't know.
And if you turn next, please, to CD 5.7. So CD 5.7. So CD 5.7 is the HELAR 2020, isn't it? Sorry, 2023.
Yes.
Okay. And the site was examined as two parcels, LD4 and LD6, wasn't it?
I believe so, yes.
And if you turn, please, to Mr. Armstrong's evidence at 550. So Mr. Armstrong's main proof at 550 on page 46. So 550, so page 46. And the conclusions of the HELAR were, if you look at the three paragraphs in bold, firstly, that the site was well located, correct?
Well located in the settlement.
Yeah. Next, at 551, the conclusion is that overall the site was suitable, wasn't it?
Yes.
And 552, again, no heritage assets which the development of this site could harm, subject to some surface water flood risk, could be mitigated. Overall, the site is suitable depending on the access, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the HELAR supports the contention that the site is accessible and adjacent to a sustainable settlement, doesn't it?
It doesn't say it's a sustainable settlement. It says it's a sustainable location within the settlement, or an appropriate.
Listen to the question. The HELAR supports the conclusion that the site is accessible and adjacent to a sustainable settlement, doesn't it? Otherwise, it wouldn't have been considered suitable.
I would need to look at more detail in the HELAR to answer that question. I don't. The HELAR is looking at the location of the site, its access to services and facilities, and any designations in or around the site.
Okay.
It's not necessarily taking a, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, it's not taking a conclusion as to whether or not each settlement is a sustainable settlement.
Okay. The officer concluded in terms that Latchingdon was a sustainable settlement, didn't he?
Which officer, sorry?
The officer in the report, the reporting officer.
Sorry, are we talking about the
So-
officer in which officer are we talking about?
Okay, I'll take you to the document. So, document CD 2.1. CD 2.1. So this is, apologies. if
This is
people
the
like-
committee report, officer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
And if you find, please, paragraph 4.1.7.
I thought you meant that, Mr.
Yeah, no, apologies. So it's my fault. So at the end of 4.1.7, the officer is concluding in terms that Latchingdon is a sustainable settlement, correct?
That was his assessment. I don't agree with that assessment.
Right. And on the authorities case, there's no unacceptable highway impact, is there?
No, there isn't.
There's no infrastructure impact which cannot be met by conditions or 106, is there?
No.
And so it follows that this proposal derives very significant weight from the social role of sustainable development, doesn't it?
No.
Well, it must do, even on your analysis. because there's some benefit from delivering market homes. There's a substantial benefit from delivering affordable homes. So even on that basis, it's deriving collectively very significant weight from the social role of sustainable development. That's unanswerable.
From the social role?
Yes.
Yes. There is weight from the social.
In terms of the economic role, the NPPF at paragraph 85, could you turn to that?
Paragraph
85, sir. You'll be familiar with this. Significant weight should be placed on the need to support economic growth and productivity. Taking these matters simply, there'll be investment in construction, consequent direct, indirect and catalytic economic benefits. Employment, Mr. Armstrong tells us, supporting 496 people, an office hub of 100 square metres, and a very significant increase in local spends when high streets are under pressure. That's a benefit of significant weight in the terms of national policy, isn't it?
Well, I'm not agreeing that it's a significant benefit. I know that's not your question, but you're asking me to look at the NPPF and analyse those benefits against it.
Not really. I'm just trying to give you some brief context because these questions, I think, respectfully, are very simple and they're fairly routine at this type of inquiry. We know what national policy is saying. We know what the economic benefits of the proposal are. They're not contested. In those circumstances, those economic benefits should be afforded significant weight, shouldn't they?
Yes.
Thank you. Next, the environmental benefits. There are no adverse impacts in terms of flooding, noise, air pollution or heritage, are there?
No.
So then the public open space, please. 4.25 hectares of the site would be multifunctional public open space, wouldn't it?
Yes.
That's 42% of the site. And if I ask you to turn, please, to the appendices of Mr. Mulpriest. And this is the illustrative master plan. I think it's just the first appendix, sir. I have it.
This is the landscape.
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah.
And if we just look at this very briefly, the open space, because the inspector can certainly read a plan better than I can. But what that 4.25 hectares of open space will deliver is informal open space, a kickabout area, youth provision, allotments, and 2 children's play areas, correct?
Yes.
And it's set out essentially all along the central portion and the eastern boundary, isn't it?
It is.
And it will be accessible to existing and future occupiers, won't it?
Yes.
And it will be managed and maintained in perpetuity, won't it?
Yes.
And again, just looking briefly at the NPPF, paragraph 96. So paragraph 96. It's government policy to achieve healthy, inclusive and safe places, isn't it?
Yes.
And to promote social interactions.
Yes.
And specifically high quality public open space which encourages active uses.
Yes.
To enable and support healthy lifestyles. So this level of provision is strongly supported by the NPPF, isn't it?
Yes.
And if you turn please to CD 4.3. So CD 4.3. This is the Green Infrastructure Strategy SPD.
Okay.
And this is an SPD which has gone through consultation and adoption, isn't it?
Yes, sorry, bear with me, I'm just...
Oh,
trying to bring it
apologies.
up.
CD 4.3. And if you find, please, table 2.1 on page 43.
Sorry, just having a few problems. Hold on.
And that's page 47 on the PDF, page 43 of the internal document. And table 2.1.
Can't see the page numbers. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, PDF page
47.
Yes, okay, got that.
And if you look at typology, the typology, 5 down, natural and semi-natural green space.
Yes.
It says to investigate the potential to create new accessible green spaces in or around Latchingdon, doesn't it?
It does.
It's unknown if we're meeting the standards. And if I look at leaps, they're below standard, aren't they?
Yes.
Neeps are below standard,
Yeah.
and a lot.
wondering, Mr. Cannock, if you could, for the benefit of members of
sorry,
the public, well, I know we use all these rather peculiar terms, but I just wonder whether maybe you could just explain what.
You're putting me on the spot now. A leap is a locally equipped area of play, so a relatively small type of children's play provision with 5 different play types, including safer surfaces that people will be familiar with. A NEEP is a neighbourhood equipped area for play, so that's providing a multi-use games area or a skate park with a sort of minimum activity zone of about 1,000 square metres, that sort of provision. And we see then that allotments, the leaps and the neeps, are all below standard, don't we?
Yes.
So what I see then is the provision provided by this proposal is significantly above what is required by policy, isn't it? Firstly.
Yes.
And it's supported by the council's own Green Infrastructure SPD.
Yes.
And that amount of open space, 4.25 hectares, publicly available in perpetuity, is a benefit of significant weight, isn't it?
I believe it's a benefit of moderate weight, because I don't disagree that the quantum of provision is of great benefit, but it's also a question of where that space is to be located, where those facilities are to be located.
Next, please, BNG. A consequence of the significant areas of open space is a very significant biodiversity net gain, correct?
Correct.
And it's agreed in the statement of common ground that it's a very significant net gain, isn't it?
Correct.
And so that then leaves, with my remaining time, please, the impact on the character and appearance of the area. Could you turn, please, to the NPPF 180 and 181? And we can agree simply that the site is not internationally, nationally or locally designated, is it?
No, it's not.
It's not a designated landscape, is it?
No, it isn't.
It's not a valued landscape, is it?
No, it isn't.
It has no statutory status or identified quality in the development plan, does it?
No.
And it's not protected then within the terms of paragraph 180A, correct?
Correct.
And just to be clear, going back to a point probably seems some time ago now, policy S112, that isn't the approach of policy S112, is it? To draw a distinction between designated and non-designated sites, valued and non-valued landscapes.
No, it's not.
And if I ask you to turn up, please, the statement of common ground. So the statement of common ground CD 9.3 and paragraph 823, we see no objection is raised by the authority on landscape grounds, correct?
Correct.
And we agree that high quality design can be delivered at the reserved matters stage, don't we?
Yes.
And we agree there's no impact on residential amenity, correct?
Correct.
So that then leaves our issue about policy S112. And the issue there, as we agreed earlier, is whether the proposal will compromise the identity of Latchingdon, isn't it?
Yes.
And to do that, you have to set out firstly the existing identity of Latchingdon, don't you?
Sorry, it's also about maintaining the rural character of the district, then goes on to without compromising the identity of the settlement. So it does have, I think you need to read the first part as well as the second part.
Well, let's concentrate on the identity of Latchingdon. To address that, you have to consider first the existing identity of Latchingdon, don't you?
Yes, Latchingdon and the settlements of the district.
Okay. You have to identify something of some merit or quality which is worthy of protection, don't you?
Not necessarily. It's talking about the identity of the settlement. So it is what it is that makes that settlement as it is.
Yeah, but we agreed previously it's not a no harm policy, it's not a no change policy, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Right. So I have to identify the identity of Latchingdon, and then having done that, I have to identify surely something of some merit or quality which I should be seeking to preserve. Otherwise, I'm preserving everything, correct?
Well, you're preserving the identity. The identity is not, I appreciate, not easy to quantify. Certainly not something you can scientifically identify. It is the identity of the place, of the settlement.
Yeah.
Which is...
But if a settlement was characterised by large areas of industrial wasteland, that wouldn't be an identity that you would seek to maintain, would it?
No, it would not.
No. So you're trying to identify aspects of its identity which are of some merit then, aren't you?
Yes, I suppose you are,
Right.
although that's not... I appreciate that's not what the policy says, but I agree your interpretation makes sense.
And then you have to set out the impact on those positive qualities of the identity, don't you?
No, you're trying to scientifically take apart the policy wording. I don't think that's how it's intended. It's intended to look at the overall identity of the settlement, which isn't something you can, I don't believe, break down into various components, and nor does the policy ask you to. It's a planning judgment based upon what will compromise, change for the worse, the identity of that place.
There appears not to be a disagreement between us, that we are not simply trying to preserve the settlement. It's not a no harm policy. It's not a no change policy. Okay, we agree that. So if you're allowed change and you're allowed development, you have to express a planning judgment on whether you compromise the identity. Okay, so you can have a change to the identity and you can have harm to the identity. Yes, because
Correct.
It's not a no change and a no harm policy. So what that must mean is that you are trying to identify what is worthy of protection, the positive qualities, and then consider the impact on those positive qualities, which is frankly the type of analysis one undertakes in respect of all such policies, correct?
In general terms,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And then you have to understand whether that impact is acceptable or unacceptable, correct?
I don't think it's a scientific exercise in the way you're breaking it down, but
No,
if
nor
it
is a judgment on acceptability.
Okay, well, if you're breaking it down in the way you're suggesting, then yes.
Okay, because if you just pick up your evidence, please, can you turn to your 4.10? So your 4.10 on page 14. You say, I'm of the view that this proposal would fundamentally alter the rural character of the site and would compromise the identity of Latchingdon.
Yes,
That is an assertion, isn't it?
that's my professional judgment.
Yeah. So let's just look then at 417. This is where we get some analysis. Again, you're talking about the change to the rural character and identity of Latchingdon, and I want to try and understand the points that you're making to support that assertion. The first is a reference to designated heritage assets, isn't it?
Yes,
Right.
although I do indicate that I'm not suggesting harm to the designated heritage
Right.
assets.
So there's no harm to their significance at all, which means that their special interest is preserved, correct?
Correct.
Right. You then talk about the core of the village. The core of the village will remain unchanged, won't it?
It will.
There's no harm to the landmarks in that core, is there?
No.
And as you've told us and demonstrated visually, there's intervening modern estates between the core and the appeal site, isn't there?
There are.
Right. And that setting of modern housing to that village core will not change, will it?
No, not for the existing development, no.
Right. So you then rely on the MDC characterisation assessment. And what this is setting out at your 418 is that villages have a nucleated or linear form. Respectfully, that's not a very helpful analysis, is it? Because we only tend to talk in two terms of settlement forms. They're either nuclear or lineated.
Well, I think the report goes on to explain the linear nature of the agricultural settlements.
Right. But what we have, you see, at 420 is the assessment was undertaken in 2006
Yes.
and provides a high-level analysis relating to a settlement type rather than a bespoke analysis relating to the appeal site or even Latchingdon.
Yes.
So if I've got a 2006 analysis at a high level, not of Latchingdon, but it's ignoring, isn't it, the subsequent development that you yourself told us has taken place since 2014.
Yes.
Right. And which the local authority considered to be acceptable, correct?
Some of it, yes.
Right. Okay.
But
And
again,
then-
sorry to interrupt, but that would
Yeah.
be under a different, some of it, if not all of it, I can't be sure, under a different context of a tilted balance.
But your point appears to be, I'm not sure that we accept it, and the inspector can form his own view that there's a change to the linear characteristic. But my point is, so what? Unless you can demonstrate some intrinsic merit, some quality that is worthy of protection, it doesn't take you anywhere, does it? Why is it that one should protect a linear characteristic as opposed to a nuclear characteristic, which is equally characteristic?
My point is that I was trying to characterize the settlement to give a sense of its historic form and put that in the context of the other settlements surrounding and the other agricultural settlements of the district, which is important, I believe, for understanding the identity of those settlements. And whilst, yes, of course, there has been modern development which has changed the nature of the settlements, that doesn't mean to say that there should be more. And my main point is that development of this scale, as I said, with such a significant increase in the size of the village, would, I believe, fundamentally change the identity of the village.
Yeah, sorry.
The test that we're looking at here is point 12 of policy S1, which does, I believe, require a planning judgment to be taken. It's not, as I said, it's not as simple as identify any specific harms and weigh them up. I just don't think that's what it's asking you to do. It's a judgment call on, is this proposal going to alter and compromise the identity of that settlement?
Yeah, look at your 421. So your 421 on page 17. What you're telling us is that the development will create a modern housing estate adjacent to other recently developed residential uses, aren't you?
Yes.
Right. That suggests, which Mr. Milcreast agrees with, that this part of Latchingdon has the identity of recently developed residential uses, doesn't it?
Of a smaller scale and of a more linear nature.
And it's fair to say that recently developed residential uses has a relatively raw urban edge, doesn't it?
Leading up to the settlement boundary.
Yeah. And so the development of more housing won't change that identity at all, save that the modern housing will extend slightly eastwards and it will create a high quality interface with the open countryside, correct?
No, I believe that the impact will be significant on the settlement as a whole, and it will fundamentally change the size and type of development, the size and nature of the settlement.
Well, sir, I'll let you make a judgment on that. I'll pick it up with Mr. Milcreast. It's a fairly respectfully simple point with which we disagree. If I just look at your table 4.22, though, what I see is that since 2014, 162 new homes have been consented, correct?
Correct.
And that tells me that Latchingdon is a sustainable location for development, doesn't it? That's what the appeals decisions say in terms, don't they?
Under the tilted balance.
Yeah.
It's not the same as, my interpretation of what is a sustainable settlement in the context of this district is what's considered sustainable by the LDP and where growth should be planned, because it's obviously a plan-led system, and that's what the council has taken a decision as to which locations are most sustainable for growth to meet the needs.
Okay.
And that's what the plan's for.
So we have 162 new homes since 2014, and certainly then that part of the settlement, its identity is of modern housing, correct?
The part shown on page 18 on the plan in my proof.
And extending the built-up area does not axiomatically lead to policy conflict, does it?
It does if it's beyond the settlement boundary.
Oh, so it does, in the terms of S112. Extending the built-up area does not axiomatically compromise the identity of the village, does it?
No, it doesn't in itself, no.
And just in terms of some of these figures then that you went through in chief, I just want to look at some of your arithmetic, please, to the extent that it's relevant, and I'm not persuaded that it is, but anyway. Your 414, there were 491 dwellings in 2011, correct?
Households,
yeah. And we then had, it's difficult, but 162 then new homes, yeah?
Yes.
If we assume, because this is all broad strokes, that 491 households are 491 houses, because I think you've said they're equivalent to one dwelling.
Yes.
So that 162 is a 33% increase, isn't it?
Yes.
To get to the 653. That 653 is the existing baseline, isn't it?
6.5 that have been granted consent.
Sorry, I've said 162. I meant 160. Right. So 160 is a third of 491, isn't it?
Broadly, yeah.
Yeah. And then that 651, that is the existing baseline against which to assess a change, isn't it?
It's what's consented. No, obviously not all of those have been built yet.
Right. And then the 160 on the appeal side is 24.5% of the 650, isn't it?
I'll trust your maths.
Okay. Because again, I didn't really understand respectfully what you were telling my learned friend when you said the appeal site is 10.12 hectares. compared to the Latchingdon settlement boundary of 19 hectares. But that 19 hectare figure ignores all of the modern development consented since 2014, doesn't it?
It does. It's a settlement, made clear it's a settlement boundary.
And it also ignores the 4.25 hectares of the appeal site that will be open space, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay. And so all that means then that there's a judgment between us as to whether the material considerations outweigh that agreed conflict with the development plan. I'm going to leave that for the inspector. Thank you, sir. Those are my questions, and thank you, Mr. Coleman, for helping me get that done well within my estimate, and I hope that wasn't too turgid for everybody.
I'm sure it wasn't, Mr. Cannock. Thank you, both of you, for that. That was most helpful. I was wondering, Mr. Wilcox, do you have much re-examination?
I have about 2 minutes.
Well, that sounds good.
It's not my practice to re-examine very often, so.
No. Well, go ahead.
Would you like me to
Yeah.
proceed first?
Yes.
Of course.
I have no particular questions that I wish to put to the witness. So if you have any re-examination points that you want to put, I mean, some of these issues in terms of character and we were talking about the urban edge and so on. I mean, these are matters that I can form a view on at my site visit. No, I mean, I don't think there's a huge amount of point in discussing these things in great depth here, because it is very much something you can appreciate on site. And I think Mr. Cannock, explained his approach in cross-examination, that he was essentially dealing with the development plan first, and then other material considerations that would weigh in favour of allowing the proposal. That was the way you structured your cross-examination. So that was helpful to have that helpful in that way. So I'll leave it to you, Mr. Wilcox, to ask any points you want to make with.
Thank you, sir, and hello again, Mr. Coleman. It's really only a single point, and this relates to my learned friend Mr. Cannock's "so what" question in respect of the loss of the linear form of Latchingdon as a settlement. And you remember he asked you about, well, so what if the linear form's lost? And that question was asked in the context of an exercise in trying to identify aspects of character or form that were, and I think his words were, of merit. Do you remember that line of questioning?
I do.
With that in mind, can you please take up once again core document 3.20, which is the characterisation assessment. Single reference I want to go to when you've got it there, please. It's hard copy, page 61, PDF page 65, which we've been to already, sir.
So this is
3.20, sir. 3.20, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is a reference we've visited before, sir. You remember we went to the specific policies section within the characterisation assessment.
Yeah.
And we looked at some of those there. And when we look under 6.3 specific policies, the first thing we find is policy 6.1 development form, which tells us the predominant linear form of the settlement should be maintained and closes and cul-de-sacs should be avoided. Mr. Coleman, what, if anything, does that tell the inspector about whether or not the linear form of settlements such as Latchingdon is a feature of merit?
Well, absolutely. It's the evidence is suggesting that it is a feature of merit, and that it should be maintained, and that to maintain it, closes and cul-de-sacs should be avoided. It's their first recommendation, and that's specific to agricultural settlement.
Thank you very much, sir. That was the only point I wanted to re-examine on.
Right. Thank you. Thank you as well, of course, to Mr. Coleman for your forbearance this afternoon. So, in fact, that effectively concludes the case for the council, doesn't it?
So that is the council's case.
That is the council's case. So, I'm just thinking about tomorrow.
Well, so sorry to apologies for interrupting, but just on that point, having heard what's been said today, I don't consider a need to call Mr. Roberts. So
No.
I think we are. I don't think anything has been thrown up. I appreciate a couple of points were taken by Mr. Coleman, but I don't think we need call him. So we've got Mr. Milcreast first, and then Mr. Armstrong.
So Mr. Milcreast first, who will deal with sort of character issues, and then Mr. Armstrong, of course. Yeah. I mean, in terms of, I think you did give some indication of chief. I think you were saying about 45 minutes each, was it? I can't remember.
Yes, that sounds like the sort of thing that I would that I would say without giving it too much thought. But I think so. If you were to work on that basis, I might shave some off Mr. Milcreast and possibly take maybe a little bit longer with Mr. Armstrong. But I'm going to reflect on the extent to which, now that we've done a lot of the heavy lifting, and respectfully, sir, tomorrow I'm going to assume quite a lot of inquiry knowledge. I'll discuss that with Mr. Armstrong, but I think it's going to be of that order, sir.
So, and in cross, Mr. Wilcox, how long do you think you might be?
So I'd have thought in the region of 45 minutes with Mr. Milcreast, maybe an hour, perhaps closer to 2 hours with Mr. Armstrong, maybe a little bit. But I think the upshot, sir, is we can comfortably get through both witnesses tomorrow.
Well, that would be good if we could, and then that would leave Thursday for roundtable discussion and on conditions and obligation. In terms of, I mean, obviously we need to do a site visit as well, but I'm just thinking in terms of closing, your closings. I know certain barristers like to have a bit of time to prepare, rather than doing it. I don't know what your approach is on these things.
Well, sir, it depends what progress we make. I mean, I think sometimes it is. The bar are very good at pretending that all of these things are really easy, but if you finish at sort of 5:30 and then you're expected to close at 10 o'clock, it does make for an uncomfortable evening.
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
I just thinking ahead a little bit, so if I may just do it in my slightly pedestrian way, can I just ask where we are on conditions and the SIL compliance statement? Because, and I don't know what your practice is, sir, but if we do get through and we don't have a full day tomorrow, it might be, if you have an opportunity to look at the conditions overnight, for example, I think sometimes it saves an awful lot of time if you were to have an informal session, just perhaps with Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Coleman, and then we can have a more formal conditions session on the Thursday. That's something to consider. I would commend to you. But I think if we were to have some time on tomorrow afternoon to do closings, that would be, I think, enough, at least for my part.
Well, I mean, I suppose it rather depends on how quickly we get through the evidence tomorrow. But I mean, let's put it this way: I'm happy, however we end up in terms of timing. I'm very happy to allow a period of time for both of you to do your closings, because frankly, I would rather allow sufficient time for you to do it properly, because it makes my job easier.
Of course.
If I have good, detailed closings, I mean, they don't need to be lengthy, but I'd rather give you extra time, as it were, to do that, rather than have it all rushed and then they're not much help to me. So we'll see how we go.
It may be, sir, that if just thinking around that, it may be if we have the conditions and obligation session on the Thursday morning, the round table, that is not something where I expect that Mr. Cannock and I will be playing a substantial role, if any.
No.
So in those circumstances, sir, that time can perhaps be helpfully reflected to a degree in finalising closings. So it may be, sir, that if we set a closing start time of something like, I'm not sure how long Mr. Cannock's custom is to be in closing, but if we were to start after lunch, 2:30, 3 o'clock or something like that on
This
Thursday.
is on Thursday afternoon.
On Thursday afternoon.
I mean, the alternative is to do it on Friday. I mean, in you know, that's the other alternative, just to allow a bit more time. I mean, we have got 4 days. It's not as if we.
No, sir. I don't need long to do my. I mean, a bit of a spoiler alert. It's going to reflect the opening.
Well, I was going to say your openings, Mr. Cannock, were quite detailed.
Well, it's just that I do find on 2 or 3 day inquiries, I like to do a bit of the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
to
No, I
start
mean,
with.
you pretty much front loaded it, haven't
correct.
you? As to use the.
So I'm feeling relatively smug.
No, I mean, you know, sometimes openings. I often have openings that are sort of a couple of pages, you know, or something like that. But yours were very detailed, so that probably means you've got less time. But we'll see how we go. We'll see how we go, and we'll I think we've made good progress today. We've got through the council's evidence, so that's good. We'll adjourn this evening then. Are you happy to resume again at 10?
Fine, sir. Yes.
Yeah, is that okay? So if we resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I don't know what the position is. Maybe the council can advise whether we're able to leave any of items in this room this evening, or do we need to clear everything out?
I know there's a council meeting on, I think it's Wednesday evening, but I'm pretty certain you're fine for this evening for sure.
Yeah, that's the case.
Right.
Lovely.
Thank you very much. So
That's what we're used to.
indeed, it's a novelty for me, I must say, having. But thank you for that information. So you all heard that. If you do want to leave items overnight, documents and so on, then you can.
And we definitely have a committee tomorrow.
Tomorrow night, not.
Well,
No.
we'll clear out. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll adjourn now then, and we'll resume tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So thank
Thank you,
you all
sir.
very much.